19 November 1943, the Central Pacific. The newly created American Fifth Fleet, under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, steams west toward the Gilbert Island chain. The assault on the Gilberts marks the opening phase of Operation Galvanic, the Navy's planned sweep across the Central Pacific to Japan. The assault forces, under the command of Admiral Richmond Turner and Marine General Holland Smith, are divided into two groups. 6,700 men of the Army's 27th Division are to land on Makin Island in the northern Gilberts, while 18,000 troops of the 2nd Marine Division are to go ashore some 100 miles south on Tarawa Atoll. Both strike forces are to be shielded by Task Force 50, under the command of Rear Admiral Charles Pownall. With 4 new Essex-class carriers and 5 light carriers, as well as the venerable Lexington and Saratoga at his disposal, Pownall can counter threats to either assault force. On 20 November, as the men of the Northern Galvanic Force prepare to go ashore, the deafening roar of the Navy's big guns splits the morning air, pounding Japanese positions on Makin. When the bombardment subsides, the men of the 27th Division head for shore. Unusually low tides complicate the landings, and by the time the men are ashore, the Japanese have regrouped and are resisting fiercely. Although they are badly outnumbered, the 800 Imperial troops on Makin are able to pin down the inexperienced men of the 27th on the beachhead. Aboard the battleship Pennsylvania, Holland Smith, known as Howlin' Mad Smith, is furious that the GIs are being tied up by such an inferior force, and declares that his Marines would have already secured the island. The delays on Makin, however, pale in comparison to the looming disaster at Tarawa. Here, 4,000 hand-picked Imperial Marines under the command of Admiral Meiichi Shibasaki are threatening to throw the assault force back into the sea. The same low tides that are causing problems at Makin are having disastrous effects at Tarawa. The coral reef surrounding the atoll prevents landing craft from approaching the beach, and the Marines must be ferried in on amphibious tractors known as alligators. Although the alligators are able to get over the reef, they are agonizingly slow and make prime targets for Japanese gunners. Once ashore, things go no better for the Marines. The naval and aerial bombardment that was supposed to silence the Japanese positions has, in fact, had little effect, and the Marines are pinned down on the beaches by a continuous barrage of machine gun and cannon fire. The men huddle behind a 4-foot-high seawall that offers the only protection from the relentless Japanese shelling. To make matters worse, the low tide has prevented the landing of desperately needed tanks and artillery. Well protected in reinforced concrete bunkers, the Imperial troops are impervious to the Marines' small arms fire. With many of the Marines' radios swamped by saltwater, communications are a shambles. Commanders offshore are unable to form a clear picture of what is happening on the beach until midday, when they receive a message: "We need help. Situation bad." After hurried consultations, Turner releases the reserves. Vicious fighting continues throughout the afternoon. Carrier-based planes pound Japanese positions to little avail. The tide refuses to rise, preventing reinforcements from reaching the beach in sufficient numbers, and ammunition and medical supplies are running dangerously low. As the sun sets over the bloody beach, now choked with bodies and smoldering equipment, the Japanese fire finally slackens and medics work feverishly to tend to the wounded. Meanwhile, on Makin, the men of the 27th have begun to make headway. Initial resistance has broken down, and the men move inland at a rapid pace. By nightfall, they are firmly established on the island, and all that remains are mopping-up operations. At dawn of the 21st, the assault on Tarawa begins anew, but with little success. The tide still won't rise, and the Japanese resistance is as fierce as ever. Still, the Marines press the attack. Using flamethrowers, satchel charges, and bazookas, they rout the Imperial soldiers from their positions one by one. Casualties are astoundingly heavy. At noon, the capricious tide begins to rise, and destroyers move in to plaster the enemy pillboxes at close range as the first landing craft clear the outer reef. As assault troops and equipment begin to pour ashore, the Marines begin to make headway. By late in the day, commanders on the ground report to Turner. Casualties many, percentage dead not known. Combat efficiency, we are winning. Fighting continues unabated through the night, and by mid-morning of the 22nd, the Marines have wiped out the remaining Japanese positions. There are, however, no great victory celebrations. Stunned by the bloody ordeal, hollow-eyed men survey the surreal battlefield in solemn silence. One observer notes, "There are no smiles on these ancient, youthful faces, only passive relief among the dead." It has been an inauspicious beginning to the Navy's Central Pacific Drive. The battle for Tarawa that was supposed to take one day has taken 3, at the cost of 1,300 dead Marines. But even as the dead are being laid to rest, American commanders are analyzing the problems and determining how to avoid them in the future. Although Tarawa was far more costly than anyone had imagined, it has taught the Americans vital lessons in how to win the Atoll War. November 20, 1943, the Sangro River, Italy. General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army struggles in what has become an all-too-familiar picture in the Mediterranean theater. Yes, it's mud again. A half-mile of the gooey stuff bulging from the banks of the river. But try as she might, Mother Nature cannot completely stop the war machine. Soldiers dump railroad ties, trees, and steel matting to solidify the ground, allowing them to reach the river's bank. At the flooding river, Montgomery's engineers take up their unenviable positions. Under intense enemy fire, they construct a bridge, and the Army once again begins to roll forward. Once forward units have crossed the swollen river, a vicious battle erupts as Montgomery's soldiers tear into the German 65th Division. When word gets back to German headquarters, Major General Siegfried Westphal is told the 65th no longer exists. With a giant gap in their defenses, Kesselring's forces are in danger of being cut off, and a division from northern Italy and another from Mignano Gap scurry to fill the hole. Meanwhile, Montgomery watches as the newly constructed bridge is washed away by the rain-swollen Sangro. The advance grinds to a halt, permitting the Germans to fortify their weak defenses. But with or without bridges, Montgomery knows he must push on to participate in a newly devised Allied strategy to take Rome. For 2 months, American Lieutenant General Mark Clark's army has been battling west of Montgomery in the mountains south of Rome. On 13 November, however, Clark halted the assault and ordered a 2-week rest for his troops, who were exhausted, suffering heavy losses and gaining very little ground. This reprieve couldn't have come at a better time, as the weather has been at its worst. The break has also allowed Supreme Commander in the Mediterranean Theater, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Army Group Commander Sir Harold Alexander to rethink their strategy. The new plan, Operation Shingle, calls for a major amphibious landing at Anzio, southeast of Rome. While the Germans are distracted there, Clark is to push up from the south and Montgomery from the east. Before this operation can begin, Montgomery, whose troops have been bogged down since the beginning of the campaign, must fight his way closer to Rome. It is a thankless job, but one crucial to Shingle's success. So Montgomery, despite his lost bridges, despite the rain and mud, and despite the Nazis' newly repaired defenses, orders the battle to resume. On 3 December, divisions take their positions along the Sangro's banks. The fighting is tough, particularly for the 78th Division, which has already lost 10,000 men in the past 6 months. Ordered to take Ortona, the 78th charges the German defenses, but are twice repelled. On 7 December, they shift the focus of their attack to Orsonia, 10 miles west of Ortona. Once again, the fighting is fierce, and once again, the British are foiled. Unable to advance, the division alters its strategy. Instead of trying to overrun Orsonia, they bypass it. The Nazis, fearing they may be surrounded, abandon the city. But Ortona still is held by the Germans. Montgomery commands the 1st Canadian Division to dismantle the enemy's stronghold. 2 horrible weeks of house-to-house fighting results in mind-staggering casualties for the Canadians as well as for the Nazis. But finally, Ortona falls. So Montgomery has moved forward, but it is not enough. The rain in the mountains has turned to snow, and a head count shows him seriously short of men, and the soldiers he does have are on the verge of collapse. Still, he must take Pescara to the north. It is the lock that must be broken to pass through the back door to Rome. December 1943, Washington, D.C., ending months of speculation. President Franklin Roosevelt announces that General Dwight D. Eisenhower will be Supreme Allied Commander for the impending invasion of Hitler's Fortress Europe, Operation Overlord. After the Tehran Conference, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, having been forced to commit to Overlord, informed Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke that although he had been promised the command, the job was going to Eisenhower. The fact that the Americans were supplying a preponderance of the men and equipment for the operation gave him little choice but to concede Ike's appointment. Although command of the operation has just been assigned, preparations for it are already well underway. England is quickly becoming the largest armed camp in history. Ports are taxed to their limits by the prodigious amounts of men and equipment pouring into the country. British cities are bursting up the seams with brash young Americans, and the once serene English countryside is now home to bustling tent cities and mountainous supply dumps. Knowing Overlord will be a tough fight from the outset, Allied commanders train their men night and day, hoping all the practice will pay off. A premium is put on physical stamina as the men prepare for what will surely be an exhaustive campaign of forced marches and sleepless nights. Searching for terrain similar to that of Normandy, commanders settle on 26 square miles near Slapton Sands on the southwest coast of England. Here, assault troops practice charging beach defenses as live ammunition crackles above their heads. Small inland villages are evacuated, and troops use the deserted lanes to hone their street fighting skills. Although the exercises are not the real thing, the men take them deadly seriously. Veterans of North Africa and Sicily know that the enemy is well trained and that on the battlefield, that can make all the difference. They make sure that green recruits know it too. Slackers are gently encouraged to shape up, as their very lives and the lives of the men around them will soon depend on it. The ports, pastures, and beaches of England are not the only place where preparations for the invasion are evident. In France, the Germans are busily preparing to greet the Allied invasion. A 2,400-mile-long string of coastal fortifications is being constructed from the North Cape in Norway all the way to the French-Spanish border. The line of defenses, known as the Atlantic Wall, consists of everything from machine gun pits to massive coastal guns concealed in impregnable concrete bunkers. Construction of the defenses began in early 1942 under Todt, the giant state public works organization. Germans too old for military service and thousands of slave laborers toil ceaselessly to build Hitler's impregnable fort. Many in the German High Command, however, including Armaments Minister Albert Speer and Field Marshal Gert von Rundstedt, believe the Atlantic Wall is mere folly. They remember all too well how easily France's vaunted Maginot Line was neutralized, and believe that expending valuable resources on fixed defenses is an enormous strategic blunder. They do not, however, press the point with the Fuhrer. In early December, Hitler dispatches Field Marshal Erwin Rommel on an inspection tour of the Atlantic Wall defenses. The purpose of the trip is twofold. First, it is a propaganda ploy to help calm Germans nervous about an Allied invasion. Second, it is intended to worry the Western Allies, who well remember the bitter defeats in North Africa at the hands of the crafty Desert Fox. Despite the imposing nature of the concrete bunkers, Rommel is not impressed. He announces that the troops stationed here are barely adequate and scoffs at the Luftwaffe's assertions that it will dominate the skies over the battlefield. He warns that if the invasion is not stopped at the beaches, the days of the 1,000-year Reich will be numbered. While dogging the Nazis' trail through Italy, the Allies have encountered horrendous logistical difficulties. Casting about for a solution to the problem of moving men and supplies through a terrain rich with mud pits, mountain ridges, and broken bridges, American commanders have racked their brains. Looking over the vast array of machinery made available by the United States industrial might, they have found a solution that is old-fashioned and at the same time far more sophisticated than any man-made tool: the humble Missouri mule. Brought by the thousands to Italy, the mule is well suited to military service. It is smart and muscular, more stable than a horse, and has a hide thick enough to withstand whatever Mother Nature throws its way. Of course, the mule's defining characteristic, its stubbornness, does occasionally interfere with military discipline. This creature's inborn propensity to do the exact opposite of what is desired necessitates a certain period of training. The principal purpose of this training is to make the mule and its handler, called a mule skinner, capable of working together. These times spent learning to trust one another never fail to yield their share of tender moments. Once educated, a train of mules is as good a group of friends as a GI could wish for. Look at how much just a single mule can carry. Multiply that by 10 or 20 mules, and there's not much left for the GIs to lug through the hills. There are trade-offs, however. While the 1,300-pound animals do a magnificent job of carting equipment over mountains impassable by jeep or truck, they remain unable to tip their own toenails. So it falls to the GIs to tend to the mules' toiletries. Feeding, chewing, trimming, tooth filing, and tail braiding are the order of the day for Army mule skinners, while veterinarians have the unenviable honor of administering shots to the creatures. It is a much more involved job to keep a mule up and running than a jeep, so much so that the Allies have established a military board devoted entirely to foraging for necessary mule supplies. Not to say that the U.S. Army has started a trend, but there have been increased sightings of military mule deployment. In the Allied efforts in Italy, the British of the ever-courant Free French have been using an increasing number of the creatures. The Germans, having shelled to death some 1,500 Allied mules on Sicily, have brought their own to Italy. Elsewhere, both the U.S. and Japan are now using them in the balmy jungles of the China-Burma-India theater. Who can pinpoint the motivation for this mule madness? While on the surface it seems merely the practical use of a relationship forged in our two species' distant past, perhaps there is something deeper. Perhaps the intractable animal serves as a mirror in which soldiers of all countries can see themselves, sturdily carrying on their shoulders the weight of victory, stubbornly refusing to yield their burden in the face of adversity, and stoically working, without complaint, towards their common goal. December 1943, Hanover, Germany. On a bombing mission 200 miles behind German lines, the expected formation of Allied bombers arrives with unexpected company: Allied fighter planes. The fighters are P-51 Mustangs, sleek and fast, with a range far greater than any other Allied pursuit craft. Until now, the Allies have not had a fighter capable of penetrating deep behind the front lines. Left undefended, bombers made easy targets. The Luftwaffe would swoop in, knocking dozens of the lumbering heavies out of every large formation. These missions lost highly trained bomber crews at an alarming rate, and high-priority targets have gone untouched because the cost of attacking them was simply too high. But now that has changed. Nazi spotters unfamiliar with the aircraft's profile report back to Berlin that the Allies have a new type of aircraft. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring discounts the reports as delusional and orders that the forward observers be reprimanded. Göring is, in a sense, correct. The Mustang is not a new aircraft. It has been around since before the American entry into the war. The Mustang's lineage can be traced back to 1939, when American manufacturers had in development many new aircraft, among them the P-46, a sleek fighter that never made it off the drawing board. General Hap Arnold, concerned more with short-term productivity than long-term technological superiority, abandoned the P-46 in favor of the more easily mass-producible Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. The Army approached North American Aviation, best known for production of the B-25, about assembling P-40s under license to Curtiss. North American offered instead an entirely new fighter based on the P-46. In an engineering feat that instantly became legend, the first Mustang rolled off the line only 100 days later. The prototypes ended up in the hands of the British. The pilots of the RAF had no use for a plane with the Mustang's slow rate of climb and poor performance at high altitude. An offhand remark by a British test pilot, however, saved the Mustang from obscurity. Impressed by the plane's aerodynamic design, he suggested that engineers remove the original Allison power plant and replace it with a more powerful, British-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The engineers did, and in late 1942, the first P-51Bs with Merlin engines took to the air. The results were stunning. The plane had a better balance of speed and maneuverability than anything in the sky. Most importantly, the addition of a fuel tank behind the pilot and disposable wing tanks gave the P-51s a combat radius of 850 miles, the distance from Dover to Berlin. Allied planners knew that with the skies full of P-51s, no longer would the Luftwaffe be able to harass Allied bombers without fear of reprisal. But what they didn't realize was that the flocks of modified Mustangs in German airspace would also change the war on the ground. Because the P-51 has such tremendous range, it can finish its escort duties with fuel left over. The pilots quickly recognized the opportunity and started swooping in low to harass targets of opportunity on the ground. The Luftwaffe suddenly has to defend not just against long-range bombers, but also against Mustangs hopping around the hedge tops. The presence of Mustangs over Germany is a huge shift in the balance of power. Though Göring initially discounted reports of a new fighter, he soon enough seized the new intruders for himself. Though a devoted Nazi, he is also a military realist. As the bombs fall once again on Germany's capital, he comments to an aide that Allied fighters in German skies can only mean that the war for the Third Reich is all but lost. December 1943, Cape Gloucester, New Britain. As dawn breaks, the men of America's 1st Marine Division board amphibious landing craft and prepare to go ashore. Their goal, a small Japanese airfield on the northwestern tip of New Britain, is the second objective targeted this month in a two-pronged Allied operation called Dexterity. The intended purpose of these assaults is the isolation and entrapment of the Japanese air and naval base at Rabaul on the eastern end of the island. On 15 December, the first movement of Operation Dexterity began when U.S. and Australian troops went ashore at Arawi on the southwestern coast of New Britain. Their mission was twofold: to seize Japanese PT boat bases there and to divert enemy attention away from Cape Gloucester. Most of the troops in the area, weakened by malnutrition and malaria, had already begun to retreat toward Rabaul. Since the Arawi landing, American and Australian troops have pursued the Japanese inland while Allied bombers soften up the island in preparation for the landings at Cape Gloucester. Now, as those landings get underway, these preparations are paying off. The Marines hastily establish a beachhead, round up a small party of Japanese stragglers, and begin their push into the jungle. The Marines continue to advance despite several determined Japanese counterattacks, and the next day's thrust brings them within 1,000 yards of the airfield where the Japanese have established their last line of defense. The Americans begin the slow job grinding the blockade down. On 29 December, reinforcements arrive from the 5th Marine Division, and by day's end, the airfield is in Allied hands. With the coming of the new year, the Americans encounter the toughest fighting yet on New Britain. For 2 weeks, they battle for the high ground above Borgan Bay, just east of the beachhead. The 141st Japanese Infantry Regiment finally capitulates, however, and begins retreating toward Rabaul. With the victories at Arawi and Cape Gloucester, it seems that at last, the fate of the 135,000 Japanese at Rabaul is sealed. They have little to do but wait for the enemies to sweep across New Britain for a coup de grace, or to watch the remainder of the war from an island fortress that has effectively become a prison. After 4 years of worldwide conflict, there are few that would argue that the airplane has not forever changed the nature of warfare. Great cities have been reduced to mere rubble by massive fleets of bombers. Lines of supply and communication, once easily secured, now lie vulnerable to enemy air attack, and ground support aircraft have become an integral part of any operation. Indeed, the airplane is such an effective instrument of war that if one expects success on the battlefield, one must control the skies above it. A good way of gaining this all-important air superiority is to eliminate the competition by attacking enemy airfields. No doubt recalling the humiliating destruction of his air force during the Japanese assault on the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur observed there is nothing more helpless than an airplane on the ground. Both sides have taken full advantage of this fact, often with such success as to turn the tide of an entire battle. At Pearl Harbor, as in the Philippines, marauding Japanese planes eliminated their potential opposition with massed attacks on American airfields. In August 1943, Japanese air power in New Guinea was virtually wiped out by the American 5th Air Force's attacks on the airfields at Wewak. Air bases with tons of explosive ordnance, weapons, and fuel, all in close proximity, present an attractive target to ground attack pilots. Accuracy counts for little as flying debris and shrapnel set off secondary explosions that are often more destructive than the original blast. Planes in neat lines along a runway are easy pickings for the machine guns of low-flying fighters. In Italy, however, good old American ingenuity combined with the Italian tradition of winemaking have combined to provide protection to exposed aircraft. Giant wooden barrels that for centuries have imparted their rich earthy flavors to Italian table wines are now being used to stop German bullets. Shipped to the airfields on trucks, the huge barrels are set into place in a horseshoe shape and filled with dirt. Once the first layer is secure, an earthen ramp is built so that a second tier can easily be rolled into place. The dirt is then tamped down and sandbags are put on top to complete the revetment. The planes parked neatly inside. Simple and effective, the barrels protect aircraft from anything but a direct hit. These barriers are proving popular with airmen and soldiers alike. The pilots like the fact that their babies are afforded the increase in protection, and the GIs, always willing to do whatever is necessary to help win the war, work diligently to drink enough wine so that every plane in Italy can have its own Chianti castle. December 1943, the Russian front. For the men in the trenches here, New Year's Eve brings little relief from the fighting and none from the constant battering by Mother Nature. Yet this year, there is decidedly more holiday cheer, as it were, in the Russian camps. Although they know the Germans are far from beaten, they are steadily driving the invaders from their soil. 1943 has seen the war turn dramatically in favor of the Russians and their Western allies. In January, the stunning defeat of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a year of continuous setbacks for the Axis. With the Russians beginning to hold their own in the east, Western Allied leaders meeting in Casablanca in January were cautiously optimistic. Hitler's vaunted Afrika Korps had been thrown out of North Africa, and the Japanese advance had been checked in the Pacific. Still, the war was far from won. German armies were still firmly in control of most of continental Europe, their lines stretching deep into the heart of Russia. And although Japanese expansion had been checked, the bitter fighting on Guadalcanal portended a long, bloody fight across the Pacific. Since that time, the situation has changed dramatically in most every theater. In Russia, the fighting has been as bitter as ever, but now it is the Russians who are advancing. Since their glorious victory at Stalingrad, the Soviets have given the Nazis little respite. The Red Army has liberated town after town across the vast Russian interior, driving the exhausted Wehrmacht before them. At Kursk in July, the Germans lost 30,000 men and almost 300 tanks in the largest armor battle of the war. The Eastern Front has, in fact, become a hellish nightmare for the German troops. Their supply lines are overextended, forcing them to live and fight in an environment for which they are hopelessly ill-equipped. Conversely, they now face an increasingly well-supplied Soviet army, fighting not only to win, but to avenge the deaths of millions of their countrymen at Nazi hands. Just as Stalin's armies are better equipped, so are all the Allied armies. In fact, perhaps the most telling of Allied victories in 1943 was won in American factories. There, far out of range of enemy bombers, production of planes, ships, guns, and ammunition has grown exponentially, far outpacing Germany and Japan's industrial capacity. The Japanese, too, have faced a year of frustrating defeats, including the loss in April of their greatest naval strategist, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, to American P-38s over Bougainville. In February, after a long, bloody fight for Guadalcanal, the Japanese were forced to cede the island to the Americans. Despite the bitter defeat, Japanese leaders still believed their strategy was a sound one. With heavily defended island fortresses spread across the southern and central Pacific, it would take decades and hundreds of thousands of casualties for the Americans to complete the drive to the home islands. Japan gambled that the American public would be unwilling to accept such heavy losses and would force their leaders to negotiate a peace. What they failed to account for, however, was the Americans' hit-'em-where-they-ain't strategy. Bull Halsey has, in one short year, climbed the Solomon Ladder by bypassing heavily defended islands for others, such as Vella La Vella, that are just large enough to accommodate an airfield. Thousands of crack Imperial troops have been rendered impotent, stranded behind the rapidly advancing Allied lines, cut off from resupply and reinforcement. General Douglas MacArthur, too, has utilized the leapfrog strategy. In New Guinea, troops under his command captured the vital bases at Lae and Salamaua with little resistance. Imperial air power on the island was virtually wiped out by a surprise attack by low-flying B-25s on the Japanese airfields at Wewak. Japanese air power in the Pacific has suffered crippling losses. The Americans are flying planes vastly superior to the P-39s and P-40s they flew in the beginning of the war. On top of that, they have a seemingly endless supply of veteran pilots, in contrast to the Japanese, whose ranks of experienced flyers have been steadily depleted. It has been a tough year for the Luftwaffe as well. The improvements in Allied aircraft have eliminated the enormous advantage the Germans enjoyed early in the war. Now, instead of attacking British cities, Luftwaffe pilots' days and nights are consumed with trying to stem the tide of Allied bombers ever roaring over the fatherland. Four years of mechanized warfare have severely strained Germany's petroleum reserves, and the 10th Air Force raids on the Romanian oil refineries at Ploiești have only exacerbated the problem. Besides restricting the mobility of their armies, the scarcity of fuel has diminished the effectiveness of the Luftwaffe. Green pilots now receive less than half the in-flight training time of their Allied counterparts. While this saves precious fuel, it does little for the young flyers' prospects in battle. Still, the Luftwaffe has managed to make British and American bomber crews pay a heavy price for their forays into German airspace. In November, losses over Schweinfurt were so stunning that 8th Air Force commanders halted unescorted daylight bombing raids over Germany. The Allied conquest of Sicily and the successful invasion of the Italian mainland precipitated the most dramatic change in the past year. In September, the Italians, after years of bombastically declaring their eternal alliance with the Third Reich, turned sides and declared war on Germany. Despite the betrayal of their Italian allies, the Germans, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, are mounting a ferocious defense that, along with Mother Nature, has managed to stymie the Allied advance. So, as 1943 draws to a close, things are looking up for the Allies. Indeed, there is talk on the lines of being home in time for the next New Year, of Christmas with the folks, and maybe even Thanksgiving turkey not out of a can. That optimism fuels a sense of trepidation among Allied commanders, however. In the Pacific, the island-hopping strategy may have worked brilliantly, but there remain many heavily fortified islands which cannot be bypassed. That reality was made shockingly clear on the bloody beaches of Tarawa, where 1,300 Marines died. In Russia, the Nazis are without doubt on the run, but Red Army commanders know that the German army remains a well-trained, deadly enemy. As they retreat, their supply lines will shorten. The spring thaw will come. Then the Russians will likely face a rejuvenated Wehrmacht that has proven itself on the battlefield the equal of any army in the world. It is Western Europe, however, that causes the most apprehension in the Allied leadership. With men and equipment pouring into England in prodigious quantities and training building to a fever pitch, the cross-channel invasion of Fortress Europe looms larger every day. The ferocity of the German defense in Italy only helps to raise anxieties of the commanders who will face Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Still, the prospects for 1944 look bright. The Germans will soon face a three-front war, not to mention fleets of American and British bombers with fighter escorts. And in the Pacific, Japanese military leaders are increasingly frustrated and confused by the unpredictable Americans. For the soldier on the front, however, the larger strategies have little bearing on his outlook for the new year. The weather will likely be miserable. The food will likely be unpalatable. Sleep will likely be deficient. But the fighting will certainly be deadly. January 1944, Central Italy. General Mark Clark confers with 5th Army commanders on the upcoming offensive against Germany's vaunted Gustav Line. Protecting the southern passes into the Liri Valley, the Gustav is the last obstacle between the Allies and a wide-open march to Rome, and Clark is determined to breach it. The key to doing that is the town of Cassino, anchor of the German positions. Cassino is dominated by a 900-foot rise which commands the wide valley before it. Atop the rise is Monte Cassino, a Benedictine monastery which the Allies fear the Germans will use to level artillery fire on the valley below. Reaching the German defenses will be no easy task, as they are fronted by the Rapido and Garigliano rivers. Clark's commanders, remembering all too well the difficulties encountered at the rain-swollen Volturno, are wary of another forced crossing into the teeth of German defenses. Acknowledging the risks, Clark orders that the attack begin. On 17 January, 3 divisions of the British 10th Corps launched their attack across the Garigliano. In the center and on the left flank, the assault troops quickly cross the river and establish a beachhead. On the right flank, however, spirited resistance by the 14th Panzer Corps foils the Brits, who are unable to gain a foothold. On the 18th, with 2 British divisions firmly established on the north shore of the Garigliano, German commanders ordered reserve units stationed near Anzio to move south to meet the attack. On 20 January, Clark orders the U.S. Second Corps to join the fray, and the men of the 36th Division launch their attack across the Rapido near San Angelo. Things go disastrously wrong from the start. Attacking across a 4-mile-wide plain with both flanks exposed, the men of the Texas Division are subjected to withering machine gun and mortar fire. Assault boats, riddled with shell holes, sink in the rain-swollen river. The scattered groups who manage to reach the north bank are quickly wiped out by swift, sharp counterattacks. The German artillery that had worried Allied commanders ceaselessly pounds the assault troops, throwing them into disarray. The attack quickly loses all cohesion, and confusion reigns supreme. By nightfall, it is clear the attack has failed. Despite the tremendous cost, Clark is determined to gain a foothold on the far bank of the Rapido and orders the 36th to try again on the morning of the 21st. Again, the Germans have little problem repulsing the attack, and by evening, the 36th Division has lost almost 1,700 men, dead, wounded, or missing. The attack is called off. Unable to bull through the heavy defenses at San Angelo, Clark decides to attempt a crossing north of Cassino, where the Rapido is wider and shallow enough to wade. The job falls to the veteran 34th Division and the French Expeditionary Corps. On 24 January, the men of the Red Bull Division launched their attack. Despite difficulty in getting heavy armor across in support of the infantry, the crossings are a success. Once on the north bank, however, the Americans again run into trouble. German minefields and concentrated artillery fire take a heavy toll on the already undermanned 34th. Stone farmhouses, turned into fortified pillboxes, slow the advance and inflict heavy casualties. Upstream from the 34th, the French troops under General Alphonse Juin have successfully crossed the river at Monte Belvedere, 5 miles north of Cassino. Driving north into the hills, Juin hopes to turn the German right flank and drive west into the Liri Valley. Despite a difficult uphill fight, by 3 February, the Americans take Monte Castellone, north of Cassino. On the 12th, unwilling to give up the strategic high ground, the Nazis launch a vicious counterattack. This time, however, it is the Germans who suffer the brunt of the battle. Artillery fire, earmarked for the entrenched Americans, falls short of its target and kills scores of the Wehrmacht soldiers. The Americans, for once controlling the high ground, take full advantage of their position and rake the advancing Germans with machine gun and small arms fire. By nightfall, the Germans withdraw. Although it has come at a tremendous cost, Clark now has his foothold on the north bank of the Rapido. Now he must find a way to dislodge the Germans from Cassino. It is clear that a frontal assault would be suicide. From their lofty position, the Germans could easily blunt any attack before it began. For now, he will wait and allow Second Corps to lick its wounds, content in the knowledge that he is tying up German units that are badly needed to the north. 22 January 1944, Anzio, Italy. In an operation that has been the topic of heated debate in the Allied leadership, American and British troops under the command of Major General John Lucas go ashore at this vital port 30 miles south of Rome. Surprisingly, resistance is virtually non-existent, and by the end of the day, over 36,000 troops, mostly from the American 3rd and British 1st Divisions, have landed, suffering only 13 casualties. While Lucas is pleased with the initial success, he is still wary of the operation as a whole. In fact, there are many Allied commanders who feel the landing is doomed to failure. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, however, believes it will shatter the entire German 14th Panzer Corps and propel the Allies into Rome. After months of tempestuous debate, Churchill managed to convince his Allied counterparts to attempt the ambitious operation. As Churchill envisioned the plan, General Mark Clark's assault on the Gustav Line would draw German reserves south from Rome, after which Lucas' 6th Corps was to land at Anzio, drive inland into the Alban Hills, thereby cutting German supply and communication routes. Although that is how Field Marshal Harold Alexander described the plan to Clark, Clark was less ambitious in his directive to Lucas. Fearing the Germans would be well entrenched in the Alban Hills and launch a deadly counterattack, Clark warned Lucas not to stick his neck out, but rather to seize and secure a beachhead at Anzio. That is exactly what Lucas intends to do. Instead of exploiting the opportunity to drive inland against such light resistance, his concern is with getting the rest of his corps ashore and establishing defensive positions. The Germans, meanwhile, are wasting no time in reacting to the landings. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring immediately begins to move troops from northern Italy, France, and the Balkans to contain the Anzio beachhead. Hitler dispatches Colonel General Eberhard von Mackensen, a distinguished veteran of the Eastern Front, to destroy the abscess south of Rome for the honor of the Wehrmacht. In Hitler's eyes, it is crucial that the Anzio landing be an unmitigated disaster for the Allies. His concern is not only keeping American and British troops from marching into Rome, but to discourage the Allied leadership from launching an amphibious operation against the coast of France. In London, Churchill is livid. In his eyes, the operation is failing simply due to Lucas' lack of drive. He complains to Alexander, "I expected to see a wildcat roaring into the mountains, and what do I find? A whale wallowing on the beaches." Meanwhile, at Anzio, Lucas continues to cautiously expand his beachhead, and German resistance begins to stiffen. In fact, in just over a week, the Germans have transferred 8 top-notch divisions into the area. By 30 January, Lucas is in striking distance of his first major target, the city of Cisterna on Highway 7. The assault, led by American Rangers, is a disaster. Cisterna, which was thought to be lightly defended, is in fact crawling with German paratroops. Vicious house-to-house fighting ensues, and the Americans are cut to pieces. By the end of the day, all but 6 of these 767 Rangers are dead or captured. Lucas is forced to call off the attack and orders his 6th Corps to set up a defensive perimeter. The Allies now have over 70,000 troops ashore at Anzio and more than 350 tanks. The Germans, however, have some 90,000 troops determined to contain and smash the beachhead. Although Lucas is under fire from Churchill and others in the Allied leadership for his lack of drive, he is certain that his actions have been prudent. Had he driven inland at a rapid pace, his lines would have been easily severed by a German counterattack, and the beachhead would have been crushed. As it is, he holds a solid position that is tying up 8 German divisions that could be helping on the Gustav Line to the south. For now, he will sit, wait, and hope that Mark Clark's 5th Corps can break the stalemate at Cassino and relieve his position. Then, he and Clark will march triumphantly through the streets of Rome. January 22, 1944, Pearl Harbor, the 5th Fleet under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance gets underway. Its target, the Kwajalein Atoll chain in the Marshall Islands. Joining the 5th Fleet is Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58. Called Flintlock, this mission is one of the largest and most complex naval operations ever mounted. Planning for an invasion of the Marshall Islands had been in place for some time, but the catastrophe at Tarawa in November gave American planners pause. Debate raged throughout the American High Command. Thinking was divided basically along two lines: those who saw a campaign in the Marshalls as a doomed repetition of the events at Tarawa, and those who championed the great strategic advantage to be gained through victory in the Marshalls. General Douglas MacArthur wanted the Pacific War to follow his plan for a sweep up through the Philippines, and felt that the Central Pacific Atoll War was a waste of men and time. Admiral Ernest King vehemently disagreed and asserted that Japanese communications could be disrupted and their forces divided if the Marshalls were taken. King found a supporter in General Hap Arnold, who knew the next target after the Marshalls would be the Mariana Islands, which would provide airstrips close enough to Japan for his new long-range strategic bombers to strike Tokyo. Victory in the Marianas would also cut off Japanese air and sea support to their troops in the Caroline Islands, home to Truk, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific. At a meeting at Pearl Harbor in mid-December, the dispute was finally settled and plans ironed out for Operation Flintlock. By mid-January, preparations were underway as B-24 Liberators flying from air bases on Tarawa and Macon began pummeling strategic targets around Kwajalein. Now, as they set sail for an uncertain landfall, the men of Operation Flintlock can only hope that the massive aerial bombardment will help prevent a repeat of Tarawa. Japanese Naval Commander Admiral Minechi Koga has prepared the 8,000 troops on Kwajalein for the invasion by telling them they must fight to the death, that their heroic stand will help provide time for the fortification of the Marianas and other islands closer to the Japanese mainland. On 28 January, the ships of Flintlock arrive and immediately begin pounding the islands of Roy Namur and Kwajalein. They are aided by incessant airstrikes from the fast carriers of Mitcher's task force and heavy bombers from the Gilberts. By the end of the month, every Japanese plane in the Marshalls has been destroyed. As men of the 4th Marine Division and the 7th Infantry Division prepare to go ashore on 31 January, word is received that Majuro Atoll to the east has been taken, its lone defender having surrendered to the infantry battalion waiting to storm his shores. Once they land, the men make fast advances as those few Japanese who have survived the seemingly endless bombardment are severely rattled. While they do not surrender outright, the resistance they put up is not what it might have been. By 2 February, what remains of the garrison on Roy Namur surrenders, and 2 days later, the troops on Kwajalein Island follow suit. As mopping up operations begin, preparations are already underway for an assault on Eniwetok, the next target in the Marshalls. One unexpected boon captured in Flintlock are current maps of all the Japanese bases, which will aid in the destruction of Eniwetok and Truk. Perhaps most importantly, the Americans have succeeded in turning the tragic lesson of Tarawa into a triumph. With this one display of overwhelming force, the Americans have dismantled the hub of Japan's defenses in the Marshalls and have, perhaps, found a formula that will lead to a swift and final victory over Japan. (27 January 1944, Leningrad. After weeks of furious artillery barrages, the Red Army succeeds in breaking the siege of Leningrad. Though the battle continues to rage, the breach of the Nazi perimeter brings desperately needed relief to the remaining residents of the city and is viewed by those people as the end, at least, of their war. The siege has lasted nearly 900 days. It began in 1941 as the Wehrmacht advanced across the Russian steppes. On 1 September, the Nazis surrounded the city. Adolf Hitler, believing the Russians to be an inferior race, expected a quick surrender and continued German progress across the Soviet Union. The Russians in Leningrad, however, had other ideas. Military philosophers as far back as Sun Tzu have counseled against backing an enemy into a hopeless position. For men without hope fight with a desperation that makes victory over them nearly impossible. But the Nazis did just that to the Russians, compounding their strategic failures with a list of atrocities that led the Russians in Leningrad to conclude that they would die if they surrendered. For good or ill, civilians and soldiers alike decided that Leningrad was where the Soviet Union would make its stand. For weeks, they fortified the perimeter of the city. Women, children, and those too old for military service dug trenches and gun emplacements, spurred on by reports of the relentless Nazi advance. When the siege began, Leningrad's population was nearly 3 million. Another 500,000 soldiers fell back into the city as the Nazi noose tightened. The Germans set their artillery on the outskirts of Leningrad and began to lob thousands upon thousands of shells indiscriminately into the city. The bombardment was ruinous, killing tens of thousands of people every month. The bitter winter took a toll as well, as did shortages of food and water. The people of Leningrad bent, but they did not break. The Nazi progress across Eastern Europe came to a grinding halt. The siege, though devastating, was not absolute. By a series of heroic battles, the Red Army has kept a train line open to the city. Called by the Soviets the Corridor of Death, it lacked the capacity to keep the whole city supplied, but the train could bring in some food, medicine, and ammunition. Over the course of the siege, nearly 5 million tons of supplies have slipped into the city. By the end of 1943, death and evacuation reduced the city's population to just over 630,000. The Nazis were still in their positions. The Russians were still dug in. Nothing, as far as Leningrad was concerned, had changed. Along the rest of the Eastern Front, however, the war had turned against the Nazis. The Red Army, under the command of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, pushed the Germans back toward their fatherland, winning battle after battle in the streets of innumerable Russian villages. On 12 January, the advancing Red Army reached the suburbs of Leningrad and unleashed an artillery barrage like none before. More than 100,000 shells rained down on the Germans, and 2 weeks later, the Nazis began a hasty and demoralizing retreat. No longer do shells fall in Leningrad, and as the first Red Army forces enter the city, all that can be heard through the chilly winter air is the tired cheering of Leningrad survivors. Their victory is without question an heroic one, but it has also been incredibly costly. More than 700,000 homes are uninhabitable. More than 100 museums and public buildings are rubble. Schools have ceased to exist. The transportation infrastructure is simply gone, and there is no source of clean water. The damage totals more than 45 billion rubles. More importantly, more than 1.5 million Russians are dead in the city, buried wherever there is open ground. Tempering the grief is the knowledge that Leningrad may well be the pivotal battle of the war, for it is at Leningrad that the Nazis were once and for all thrown back. Though there remains much fighting for the Red Army and much suffering for Russians still under Nazi domain, it is clear that the ascendancy of fascism in the Soviet Union is over. Russia, for all of her suffering, will not fall. February 1943, Anzio, Italy. Isolated and surrounded by 90,000 crack German troops and with no relief in sight, the men of General John Lucas, 6th Corps, continue to strengthen their defensive positions in preparation for the attack they know will come. Already, the Germans have begun pounding the beachhead with their heavy artillery, the largest of which is a 280-millimeter railroad gun that the GIs have dubbed Anzio Annie. With a 65-foot barrel, the gun is able to lob its massive shells as far as 36 miles, a feat unmatched by any piece of artillery in the Allied arsenal. The German guns fire day and night. The sheer randomness of the carnage begins to sap the morale of the Allied troops. commanders struggle to steel their relatively green troops to the realities of modern warfare. On 15 February, the Luftwaffe escalates the attack on the Allied beachhead. Scores of bombers and fighters attack shore installations and incoming supply ships. Despite their success in sinking the Liberty ship Elihu Yale, the Luftwaffe suffers heavy losses. The Allies' radar-controlled anti-aircraft fire maintains a seamless umbrella of flak over the beachhead, which keeps all but the most daring of German pilots at bay. On 16 February, German General Eberhard von Mackensen unleashes the full fury of his forces on what Hitler refers to as the abscess south of Rome. Attacking south from the city of Aprilia, he throws the full weight of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division against the American 45th Division. The fighting is savage. The Germans have at their disposal new Panther and Tiger tanks with 88mm guns capable of outdueling any Allied tank. The men of the Thunderbird Division give ground, but they refuse to give up in the face of the onslaught. Heroic stands by small groups of men slow the Nazi advance. The giant German tanks bog down in the soft earth, and Allied bazookas and anti-tank guns begin to take their toll. American ground attack aircraft also give Mackensen headaches. Buzzing around the treetops, searching for targets of opportunity, they severely limit the Germans' mobility and ravage their communications. Determined to break the Americans, Mackensen commits his Infantry Lehr regiment to the fray. Although they are green, the Infantry Lehr has been touted as one of the best trained units in the German army. Mackensen is confident that they will plow right through the exhausted 45th. He soon learns otherwise. Though the Lehr may look sharp on the parade ground, in battle they are outmatched by the shabby dog faces of the 45th. Under heavy fire, seeing their comrades killed and wounded, the highly touted men of the Infantry Lehr turn tail and run. The fighting continues unabated through the night. The Americans give ground in small pieces, exacting a high price from the attackers. By the morning of the 17th, they have fallen back to a defensive position the GIs called Dead End Road. Exhausted, their ranks dangerously depleted, they are less than 1 mile from the beaches. They have no option but to fight, and they do. Throughout the day, they repulse the Nazi attacks. Mackensen begins to realize that he will be unable to erase the abscess south of Rome. By the 19th, the Americans have regrouped and pushed the Germans back until they are over 1 mile from Dead End Road. In 3 days of fighting, the Germans have suffered over 2,500 casualties, with some of their battalions whittled down to 150 men. On 22 February, although he has withstood everything the Germans have thrown at him, General Lucas is replaced as commander of 6th Corps by General Lucian Truscott. British General Harold Alexander, while acknowledging that the stand at Anzio has been heroic, feels that Lucas is tired and lacks the drive to break out of the beachhead and proceed to Rome. Now it is up to Truscott and his commanders to find a way to break the German encirclement and push into the Alban Hills. Before he can do that, however, he must give his troops, particularly the battered 45th, a chance to regroup. For now, he will wait, secure in the knowledge that the beachhead at Anzio will not fall. February 1944, Cassino, Italy. After almost a month of brutal fighting for this vital German stronghold, the exhausted U.S. Second Corps is relieved by the New Zealand Corps. Despite continuous assaults on the city on the hill that dominates it, the Second has had little success in dislodging the well-entrenched Germans. That task has now fallen to Lieutenant General Sir Bernard Freyberg and his Commonwealth troops. Convinced that the Germans are using the Abbey of Monte Cassino towering over the city to pound Allied troops with artillery fire, Freyberg insists that the ancient monastery be bombed. This is a very touchy subject for the Allied leadership. Churchill and Roosevelt have publicly stated that historical and cultural monuments are to be spared destruction except in the case of an absolute military necessity. Some in the Allied command believe the Germans have refrained from occupying the monastery and argue against its destruction. They contend that the resulting rubble would be just as defensible, if not more so, than the intact abbey. Their doubts are well-founded, as the Germans have allowed no troops to occupy the abbey. In fact, they have removed many of its historical treasures to the Vatican and escorted the abbot to safety. Still, Freyberg is adamant and wins approval for the bombing, and it is scheduled for 16 February. On 14 February, Allied planes scattered thousands of leaflets warning of the impending bombardment and urging civilians to evacuate the abbey. The next morning dawns with unusually clear weather. Although preparations for the follow-up assault are incomplete, the decision is made to proceed with the bombing. 250 medium and heavy bombers unload almost 600 tons of high explosives on the ancient monastery, shrouding it in an enormous cloud of smoke and fire. Allied troops, the earth quaking beneath their feet, cannot believe any defenders could possibly survive such a terrific bombardment. When the smoke clears, what remains is nothing more than a pile of rubble, and Freyberg is certain that his troops will easily carry the hill. The Germans, however, have different ideas. No longer worried about desecrating the cultural monument, they quickly move to set up positions amid the massive destruction. The New Zealand Corps begins what it hopes will be the final assault, but finds out all too quickly that the bombing was a terrible miscalculation. From their entrenched positions, the Germans rain artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire on the exposed troops below. So intense is the hailstorm that the 4th Indian Division is unable to even regain the positions it recently abandoned to allow for the bombing. Poorly coordinated to begin with, the assault quickly disintegrates. Meanwhile, the Vatican lodges a formal protest against the bombing, and the Nazi propaganda machine swings into motion, accusing the Allies of robbing civilized mankind of one of its most valued cultural monuments. It is a bitter pill for Allied commanders to swallow. Not only are they subject to attacks on their morality by Joseph Goebbels and his cronies, their destruction of the monastery has only served to strengthen the German position. Clark and his commanders become increasingly frustrated. They know that breaking the back of the Germans at Cassino is essential to further progress in Italy, yet they have been unable to budge them. General Lucas' 6th Corps at Anzio is in desperate need of relief, and it is their job to provide it. So back to the maps Allied commanders go in search of some way to drive the Boche from their lofty perch. January 1944, the Central Pacific. Following their first swift victory in the Marshalls, soldiers and sailors of Operation Flintlock have swiftly dispersed to their next objectives. The soldiers who stormed Kwajalein's beaches have gotten underway for the nearby Eniwetok Atoll, while the ships of Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 have arrived at Truk, Japan's main staging area in the Central Pacific, only to find it nearly deserted. Sent to destroy the Japanese combined fleet stationed there and to divert attention from the forces landing at Eniwetok, Mitcher finds few Japanese combatant ships remain. Nonetheless, 72 American fighters take to the air early on the 17th and begin attacking those ships, as well as Japanese aircraft on Truk's Eaton Field. Through the next day, the Americans launch incessant airstrikes against the harbor and airfield, including a pre-dawn assault on the 18th. The first night bombing of enemy ships in U.S. carrier history. By the end of the day, when Task Force 58 withdraws, they do so having sunk dozens of combat and auxiliary ships and most of the planes stationed there. Meanwhile, preparations are underway for a landing on Eniwetok. On the 19th, a heavy pre-assault bombardment intended to wear down the 2,600 Japanese troops stationed there seems to work. By the time 2 battalions of the 27th Infantry go ashore, much of the fight has been pummeled out of the enemy. In only 2 days, Eniwetok falls to the Americans. At the same time, Task Force 58 has been advancing towards Japan's innermost ring of defensive islands, the Marianas. Once taken, the Marianas will provide the Navy deep water anchorages as well as airfields for the Army Air Force's new long-range super fortresses. On 23 February, following a night of fruitless enemy air attacks, the task force arrives and launches a series of aerial assaults against the islands of Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and Rota. The most remarkable aspect of this operation is the fact that while the pilots know that they're setting out to strike enemy airfields on the islands, they do not know the exact locations of those fields. Due to the swiftness of the attack, the Japanese are caught completely off guard, and Mitcher's men make short work of the inexperienced Japanese pilots. The Americans destroy 168 Japanese planes while losing only 6 of their own. The rapid and relatively easy gains in the Central Pacific drive are heartening to almost everyone in the Allied camp. Whether inspired by fear of being overshadowed by those gains or inspired by their boldness, General Douglas MacArthur has moved the date for his assault on the Admiralty Islands up by a month. Preparations for the assault have been underway since mid-January, when General George Kenney commanded a series of bombing raids to soften targets in the Admiralties, as well as to take reconnaissance photos of Los Negros and nearby Manus Island. Based on these photos, the location chosen for the landing, at that time scheduled for 1st April, was Hyanna Harbor, opposite Seadler Harbor, one of the finest anchorages in the South Pacific. When MacArthur decided to move his timetable up, the assault was hastily assembled amid some dissension from his subordinates. The conflict arose from differing estimates of Japanese troop strength on the island. MacArthur agreed with those who felt that the island was manned by a well-hidden garrison and opted to send ashore what he termed a reconnaissance in force. 1,000 men of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division are to go ashore on 29 February, with 1,500 men held in reserve. Now, on the last day of February, the reconnaissance begins, with heavy naval fire covering the landing troops. The shelling succeeds in severely rattling the Japanese, who are prepared only for an attack through Seadler Harbor. By afternoon, the 1st Cavalry succeeds in seizing their primary target, Momote Airfield. When night falls, it becomes clear from enemy attacks that high estimates of Japanese troop strength on Los Negros are correct, and the GIs begin to fall back to the edge of the airfield to firm up their position. They hold on until 2 March, when MacArthur's promised reinforcements arrive to join the battle. Through the following week, the American force fights to wear down the Japanese troops, and by 9 March, the island is in Allied hands. The Japanese response to the activities of the previous 2 months amounts to little more than shock. With the conquests in the Marshalls and the devastating raids on the Marianas and Truk, Japan's holdings in the Central Pacific are all but gone. The Americans have crossed the halfway point between their country and the Japanese mainland, and their gains seem to be accelerating. February 1944, England. Massed aircraft of the American 8th Air Force take off for Germany, opening what American troops all over Europe are calling the Big Week. More than 950 bombers and their fighter escorts head for Braunschweig and Gotha, 2 industrial centers in northwest Germany. Their target, the German aircraft industry. Since the cessation of highly accurate daylight bombing on 14 October, German aircraft production has risen steadily. At the same time, the decrease in dogfighting with Allied fighter escorts has cut Luftwaffe losses. The result? A German Air Force that has been able to rebuild its strength even as the war rages around it. On 6 January, General Jimmy Doolittle took over the 8th American Air Force. Doolittle, who had done much to revive American spirits after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by launching a daring raid on Tokyo, faces a formidable task in Europe, weakening the Luftwaffe in preparation for the impending cross-channel invasion. Almost immediately upon his arrival, Doolittle decreed a resumption of daylight raids, which, while riskier than night bombing, are also more accurate. Codenamed Operation Argument, the daylight raids resumed 14 January when 663 bombers and their fighter escorts attacked a Messerschmitt parts facility and a Focke-Wulf assembly plant. Heavy weather forced the return of more than 400 of the bombers, and the Luftwaffe downed 60, a toll not unlike that which had forced the cancellation of daylight raids to begin with. But Doolittle, whose mission over Tokyo had involved the loss of all of his planes, was not about to back off. After a retooling of the mission, the big week kicks off with a bang. Escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts and new long-range P-51 Mustangs, the bombers are never alone in the skies. Luftwaffe fighters find themselves firing not at the bombers, but at their high-speed escorts. Again, heavy clouds obscure the ground, but 25% of the bombs dropped managed to hit their targets. American losses total only 21 bombers, about 2% of those dispatched. On the ground, 2 of Germany's key aircraft factories lie in ruins. The next day, 21 February, another armada takes off, and again Allied losses are low and German damage high. The third day, Doolittle steps up the pace, adding to his attack force bombers and fighters from the 15th Air Force in Italy. To the Germans, it must seem that American aircraft are appearing from behind every cloud. An unfortunate turn in the weather forces Allied crews to take the 4th day of the big week off. The next day, 24 February, 800 Allied bombers returned to the air, severely damaging the Daimler-Benz Aero Engine Works, several factories making Me-110 fighters, and a major ball bearing plant. On 25 February, the Americans attacked from 2 directions. Coming in from the north, a force of 176 B-24s and B-17s attract most of the Luftwaffe's defenders and take heavy casualties. From the west, however, a much larger force with a full complement of escorts passes through the German defenses almost unscathed. As the big week ends, the Allies rightfully celebrate a streak of hard, productive fighting. There is no question that the raids are having an effect on the long-term viability of the Nazi Air Force. Production of Germany's Me-109 is virtually shut down, and the Nazis have been forced to salvage equipment and parts from the rubble in an attempt to resume production of other aircraft. To a degree the Allies can probably not imagine, the Germans succeed in short-term rebuilding of their aviation industry. While the big week makes the task of Germany's shrewd industrialists more difficult, the Allies have yet to make it impossible. March 1944, Burma. A large engineer camp 60 miles outside the Burmese city of Tiddim becomes the first target of a complex and daring Japanese offensive. The operation is ultimately directed towards the capture of Impel, a major Indian city located 100 miles to the north. The attack, under the command of Lieutenant General Renya Muraguchi, is intended to preempt an almost certain assault further into Burma by British General William Slim's 14th Army. Slim, who is indeed planning such an offensive and has been waiting for the Japanese to make the first move, is nonetheless caught completely off guard. The plan, as conceived by Muraguchi, calls for the westward penetration of the Indian border by a number of fast-moving columns. It is to open with the attack on Tiddim, intended to draw Slim's troops south, away from Impel. Shortly thereafter, troops of Japan's 15th and 31st Divisions are to begin driving west toward Impel and Kohima, 2 towns crucial to Slim's supply lines. By capturing the massive supply dumps in these cities, Mutaguchi would prevent any further advances by the British. Now, as the attack on the engineer camp continues, members of the Indian 17th Division rush to defend the largely non-combatant population there. They guard the camp until they receive orders on 14 March to stage a fighting retreat toward the Impel Plain. To hamper their escape, Japan's 215th Regiment establishes a roadblock north of Tongzhang. As the 17th battles through the roadblock, the second phase of the Japanese assault begins. On 16 March, Mutaguchi's divisions to the northeast pour across the Chindwin River, rapidly advancing towards both Impel and Koima. At Slim's request, 2 divisions are airlifted from Akyab Airfield to Impel. By the time they arrive on 19 March, Japanese soldiers are within 30 miles of the city. Through the rest of the month, the fighting is bloody, with little ground gained by either side. Due to the difficult terrain, battles for tiny patches of turf last days as additional British reinforcements flood into the area. Meanwhile, to the north at Koima, the British find themselves in a precarious position. Thinking the terrain too treacherous for an assault by a large Japanese force, Slim has only a token garrison defending the city. Lieutenant General Sato Katuku, however, has set his entire 31st Division against the city. As a result, Slim has been forced to rush paratroops in to stem the westward flow of Japanese troops. The battle for Koima rages through the end of the month, with the British slowly losing ground. By 11 April, however, things begin to look up for the garrison as reinforcements from the British 2nd Division and the Chindit 23rd Brigade begin pouring into the area. By late April, the lines begin to stabilize in favor of the British. While the Japanese have succeeded in severing the road between Koima and Impel, their own supply lines are non-existent. Mutaguchi gambled from the outset that his rapid advance would be rewarded with the immediate capture of supplies at Impel. Now, his men are paying the price for his failed wager. For the British, the apparent turning of the tide allows an opportunity to look ahead rather than improvising defense. With Mutaguchi's attack blunted, Slim can now prepare in earnest to drive the Japanese from Burma. 10 April 1944, Odessa. The Red Army, methodically driving the Nazis from the Soviet Union, enters the Ukrainian city, built on the shores of the Black Sea. Once known as the Russian Marseille, after the resort on the Mediterranean coast of France, today it lies in ruins, its people devastated, its future bleak. For the last 50 years, the story of Odessa and the Ukraine has been one of repeated, devastating occupations. The Soviets took the region during their push to overthrow the Tsar and kept it for themselves. In 1942, Odessa fell to the Romanian army, a force opportunistically allied with Hitler's Nazi regime. The Romanians, steeped in a history of ethnic resentment, went about the vile task of eradicating all vestiges of Russian influence and culture. That ethnic cleansing ended only 3 weeks ago when, in the face of the unstoppable Russian advance, the Romanians turned tail and ran. The Germans filled the power vacuum, knowing full well that their hold on the city, while brief, would afford them enough time to inflict some final cruelty and humiliation on Odessa and its residents, laying waste most of the city's buildings and murdering those people with whom they had even the most petty disagreement. There was, of course, no sane purpose to the Nazi actions. It is simple proof that the war in Russia, which began after the violation of a treaty that neither side had ever intended to honor, has at last fully degenerated into a kind of mutual psychosis. More than victory, both sides now seem to be concerned only with the instant gratification of revenge. It is clear that neither side remembers who started the seemingly endless string of atrocities, but both are committed to continuing them.
What moral high ground there is in this situation belongs to the Soviets. The Ukraine, while historically independent, was before the war a Soviet republic, so dictator Joseph Stalin and his generals can make at least some claim that they are liberating the city. On 8 April, the Red Army attacked, using a force of more than 500,000 men to push the Nazis back. The heavy German tanks sank into the spongy ground while the wider-tracked Soviet T-34s sped steadily on. It took only 2 days for the Red Army to overwhelm the German rear guard. By taking the port city, they have isolated the entire German 17th Army, which sprawls across the Crimean Peninsula southeast of the city. The Nazis' slim hope of escape is to fall back to the town of Sevastopol at the peninsula's tip and pray they can hold out long enough to be evacuated across the Black Sea to Romania. Confronted with the plight of the 17th Army, Hitler ranted that he could spare no reinforcements. He and his general staff are consumed with the impending Allied cross-channel invasion and refuse to consider difficulties on other fronts until it is too late to do any good. Finally, with the 17th Army's fate basically sealed, the Fuhrer accedes to his commander's earlier request and grants the army permission to retreat. Still refusing to give away a foot of ground, however, Hitler orders the 17th to leave behind 50,000 men to defend the city until the Wehrmacht can repulse the Allied invasion of Europe, when and wherever it may come. Only then, the German mastermind says, will Sevastopol be relieved. On 18 April, while the Nazis in the Crimea formulate an evacuation plan, the Russians pull tight the noose around Sevastopol. Stalin, who wants to kill Nazis even more than he wants to preserve his own territory, orders hundreds of artillery pieces to be brought in so that the Red Army can pulverize the city, its occupiers, and its residents. That roundup of artillery, far from simplifying the destruction of the 17th, gives more than 100,000 Germans time to escape. For those left behind, however, there is no hope. That Hitler refuses to authorize a surrender matters little. Stalin is not inclined to take prisoners. On 3 May, Hitler, never one to blame himself for his shortcomings as a leader, fires his commander on the ground in Sevastopol. On 5 May, the Red Army launches its all-out final assault. Waves of artillery shells, Katyusha rockets, and tanks roll over the city. German troops are hunted down in the streets, and every last pocket of holdouts is pursued and eradicated. This, on the Russian front, is what passes for liberation. The Nazis are gone from the Crimea, wiped deservedly from this plot of scorched earth. But what joy there is in the toothless smiles of civilians is tempered by the knowledge that, though liberated, they are far from free. Hitler's boot may be gone, but they are now back under the brutal thumb of Joseph Stalin. So in the end, for the poor peasants who must call this miserable place home, there has been little change at all worth celebrating. April 1944, the Admiralty Islands. Convoys carrying the American 24th and 41st Infantry Divisions rendezvous en route to Hollandia on New Guinea's North Shore. As the invasion force draws ever nearer, the Japanese holding the town are subject to an intense 3-week artillery barrage and air assault. That softening up operation is devastating, with dozens of ships and hundreds of bombers saturating the area with high explosives. Hollandia's only significance is as a stepping stone. In the surrounding jungle are a handful of airstrips that General Douglas MacArthur needs for his anticipated assault on the Philippines. The general considers the recapture of the Philippines to be a matter of personal honor. Ordered to abandon his troops at Corregidor, he arrived in Australia expecting to find a massed and ready force, capable of launching an immediate counteroffensive. In fact, there was no army, and his commanders in Washington had not even made a strategic commitment to retake the Philippines. MacArthur, by sheer force of will, changed that, getting President Roosevelt to back his single-minded thrust toward Manila. A man obsessed, he leaves little room for failure. He prepares for a hard-fought battle, assigning a large force to attack Hollandia. On 22 April, the Hawaii-based 24th Infantry Division, which suffered impotently through the attack on Pearl Harbor, comes ashore at Tanamera Bay, on the west side of Hollandia, while 25 miles to the east, the men of the 41st Division land at Humboldt Bay. Expecting a pitched battle, the invasion force instead encounters light resistance. The Japanese in the area, largely inexperienced peasant conscripts, retreat, and the Americans are able to hack their way quickly through the jungle. Within a few hours, the air base at Aitape is in Allied hands. Engineers set to work immediately, repairing the runways and getting the base ready to accept aircraft. 2 days later, on 24 April, 24 Australian P-40s take up residence at the base, providing close air support for the invasion force. For 4 days, the 24th and 41st Divisions push toward each other. The Japanese, who had abandoned the beaches, stand their ground in the jungle. Progress, though consistent, is measured foxhole to foxhole. Hand grenades and flamethrowers are used to literally blast the stubborn enemy from their hiding places. Still, as the push continues, it becomes clear that the Americans are superior, not only numerically, but also logistically. They have food, ammunition, and medicine, as well as the manpower to carry the material through the jungles and waist-deep swamps. The Japanese, on the other hand, have been cut off from lines of supply for more than a month. They have little left to fight with, or for, but their own sense of personal honor. On 26 April, units of the 24th and 41st Divisions link up at Hollandia Airfield. By the next day, the town is firmly in Allied hands. The Japanese who had held the area are all either dead, captured, or so deeply hidden in the jungle that they can't fight. And MacArthur, who had been prepared to pay a much steeper price for Hollandia than the Japanese extracted, is one step closer to the Philippines. April 1944, London. In an effort to maintain strict security for Operation Overlord, the impending invasion of Fortress Europe, the British War Cabinet announces a strict new policy prohibiting uncensored radio traffic by foreign diplomats. In addition, no diplomatic couriers will be allowed to leave the country until after the invasion takes place. The only exceptions to the new rules are envoys of the United States and the Soviet Union. This, of course, infuriates Charles de Gaulle and the French Committee of National Liberation. But with the French penchant for switching sides, American and British commanders are taking no chances. Keeping an operation the size of Overlord a secret is, strictly speaking, impossible. Britain's eastern ports are teeming with hundreds of ships. Thousands of Allied troops are conducting large-scale landing exercises. Whole regions of Great Britain have been converted to storage yards for tanks, trucks, jeeps, ammunition, and all the other paraphernalia of war. The British people, who have stood fast in the face of doom for more than 4 years, are once again called upon to sacrifice in the name of freedom. Communication with even so close a neighbor as Ireland is cut off. Travel is strictly regulated, and a 10-mile area inland from the Channel is declared off-limits to all unauthorized personnel. Within this perimeter, there is an increasing sense of anticipation and apprehension. Desperate as they may be to get on with winning the war, men throughout the Allied ranks realize that the road home runs through Berlin. Where that road begins, on what unnamed beach, they do not know. The whens and wheres of the invasion are kept even from those who will execute the largest amphibious assault in history. Charging an entrenched enemy that has proven himself a master of defensive warfare. Though the Germans know the invasion is close at hand, they are scrambling to find out when and where it will take place. Despite all the Allied efforts to maintain strict security, some information inevitably leaks out. A report smuggled out of the British embassy in Turkey alerted the Germans to the Allied plans to invade northern France, but the information is sketchy. The report incorrectly identified the code name of the operation as Overlook. Fortunately for the Allies, the document did not contain the date and location of the invasion. The Allies have for months been leaking false information to the Nazis, hoping that confusion in the first hours after the landing will keep the Germans from reinforcing the invasion point. That time is crucial. Until a beachhead is established and docking facilities brought under Allied control, the invasion force will be extremely vulnerable. For now, the Nazis are forced to defend hundreds of miles of coastline and to guess what is a real invasion and what is a diversion. Back in England, the preparations continue. New equipment is tested that will be vital to the success of the operation. Dual-drive tanks, capable of propulsion at sea as well as on land, are to go ashore with the first wave. With a collapsible flotation skirt and an extended exhaust hood to prevent the engine from flooding, it is hoped that they can provide instant fire support to the exposed infantry. In an unprecedented engineering feat, the Allies are constructing artificial harbors called mulberries that will be towed across the channel after the beachhead is secure. Once in place, they will allow the troops to be effectively resupplied in the days immediately following the invasion. As usual, tension in the Allied High Command is running high. British General Bernard Montgomery fervently believes he, not Ike, should be Supreme Allied Commander of Overlord forces. He grudgingly accepts the reality of American command. The vast majority of the forces earmarked for France are, after all, American. Still, Monty demands that he at least be given command of the ground forces, which would relegate Ike to a figurehead position. To avert a blow-up in the Allied ranks at this critical juncture, Ike offers a compromise. Monty will command the ground forces for the invasion phase of the operation until Ike can safely establish his headquarters in France. Monty has little choice but to acquiesce. The date for the invasion is tentatively set for 5 June. On that day, tidal conditions will be right, and a bright moon will provide light for airborne operations. What cannot be predicted with any certainty is the weather. As the target date approaches, tension among Allied commanders grows. They know that despite all their planning and preparation, the success or failure of what will surely be the pivotal battle of the war will depend in large measure on the whim of Mother Nature. May 1944, Cassino, Italy. In the early morning hours, the Allied forces facing the German defenses on the Gustav Line unleash a tremendous artillery barrage, marking the beginning of their latest attempt to break through. For nearly 4 months, the Allies have been hammering away at the German defenses to little avail. Bombardment of the monastery and Cassino itself has only served to give the Germans an easily defendable pile of rubble. Assault after assault has been repulsed, with the attackers suffering heavy casualties. For this latest push, however, the Allies are trying a different strategy. Instead of simply smashing through the formidable defenses, they are attempting a giant pincers movement to cut off the German defenders. Devised by French General Alphonse Juin, the new plan centers on an attack by his French Expeditionary Corps on the left flank of Cassino. When the artillery barrage lifts, Juin's troops press forward. Equipped largely with U.S. hardware, the 4 French divisions make good progress. The German 71st Division, badly outnumbered, fights desperately to slow the advance. The French, however, determined to erase the last vestiges of shame from their humiliating defeat in 1940, drive on. Within hours, they have pushed well into the German lines, capturing Mount Faito. Elsewhere, however, the attack meets with less success. To the right of the French, the British managed to gain 2 small bridgeheads over the Rapido opposite Cassino, but are quickly checked by stubborn German defense. To the north, Polish troops under the command of General Ladislaw Anders are badly bloodied by the elite German paratroops defending Monte Cassino. And on the far left flank, the U.S. Second Corps attacking up the coast is also stymied by the well-entrenched Germans. By 14 May, the Germans show signs of crumbling. Twain's troops lead the way, slicing through the defenses. Their stunning advance helps to inspire the Americans on the coast, who push the Germans back with increasing success. By 15 May, the Allies are on a roll. French success continues as they capture San Giorgio, and the British push well into the Liri Valley all the way to the town of Pignatoro. General Anders' forces, however, are still being held up by the paratroops defending the abbey. Time and again, the Poles advance, but the Germans, well concealed in the shattered ruins, drive them back with machine gun and small arms fire. On 17 May, the Germans rush reinforcements to the front to try and slow the Allied advance. Resistance stiffens, but the Allies continue to make gains. German General Heinrich von Wiedinghoff, realizing that his forces at Cassino are in danger of being cut off, decides that the time has come for a fighting retreat. On the morning of the 18th, General Anders' Polish troops launch a final push for the abbey, only to find that the Germans have largely abandoned their positions. After months of bloody fighting, the ancient monastery is finally in Allied hands. Meanwhile, the advance continues, but at a slower pace and at a higher price. The Germans, still a determined, disciplined force, have managed to regroup and are contesting every inch of ground, particularly in the Liri Valley. On 23 May, the Germans are dealt another blow. Just as it appears they may be able to solidify their lines, the Allied beachhead at Anzio erupts. A violent artillery bombardment is followed by an attack on Cisterna by 3 divisions of the U.S. Sixth Corps. American infantry and armored units plunge into the German lines. The fighting is vicious. The GIs press forward with fixed bayonets, attempting to rout the German defenders from their positions. Unmarked minefields take a heavy toll on both men and armor. Still, by noon of the 24th, the Americans reach the crucial Highway 7 southeast of Cisterna. Back on the Fifth Army front, the Allied offensive continues to make progress. The U.S. Second Corps pushes up the coast all the way to Terracina, while British, French, and Canadian forces crush the increasingly futile German resistance. Faced with an enemy advancing from the south and driving inland from Anzio, the entire German 10th Army is in grave danger of being cut off. So dire is their plight that even Hitler, who refused to contemplate retreat at Stalingrad, gives the order for the 10th to withdraw north to the Caesar Line. On 25 May, Cisterna falls, and on the shores of Lake Folian, elements of the U.S. Second Corps link up with Sixth Corps units from Anzio. Now, the town of Valmontone on Highway 6 is key to cutting off the retreating Germans. Getting there first is crucial. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring dispatches the Hermann Goering Panzer Division to reinforce the town, and Field Marshal Harold Alexander orders General Mark Clark to make for the town with all haste. For Clark, however, the lure of Rome is too great. While he dispatches the 3rd Division to Valmontone, technically fulfilling his orders from Alexander, he turns the bulk of his forces to the northeast toward the Eternal City. The 3rd Division alone stands little chance of blocking the German withdrawal. And though there is elation in the Allied ranks that the bloody stalemates at Cassino and Anzio are finally broken, many commanders feel Clark has made an enormous blunder. Although Rome is well within his grasp, the commanders know that it is, after all, just another city. Once the revelry and celebration die down, the armies must move on. Then they will face another well-fortified German defensive line manned, ironically, by the same troops Clark has just let slip through his hands at Vermonton. May 1944, Berlin. Adolf Hitler, preparing for the Allied assault on Fortress Europe, reorganizes the highest ranks of his forces in France. He names 69-year-old Field Marshal Gert von Rundstedt Commander-in-Chief of the Western Armies. Directly under von Rundstedt is General Erwin Rommel, who has been stationed in northern France for months, directing the fortification of the Atlantic Wall. Neither Rommel nor von Rundstedt are pleased with the decision. The elder Field Marshal is openly dismissive of the Desert Fox's abilities. Rommel, for his part, resents being forced to report to von Rundstedt, already twice relieved of duty by Hitler. It quickly becomes apparent that the two commanders fundamentally disagree on the best way to defeat the impending invasion. Rommel, who believes that the invasion must be stopped on the beaches, has thrown himself into the task of making the Atlantic Wall nigh impregnable. For months, he has directed the construction and manning of countless pillboxes and bunkers along the coast, and the development and deployment of steel obstacles to prevent amphibious landings. He has ordered the flooding of low-lying lands to slow the Allied advance, and placement of over 5 million mines on the northern beaches of France and atop poles in possible airborne landing sites. All of these fortifications are testimony to his belief that the war will be won or lost on the beaches. Von Rundstedt compares the Atlantic Wall to France's Maginot Line, which he himself so easily bypassed in 1940. He instead believes that the Allies can only be stopped once they begin to push inland from the beaches. As a result, he plans to hold his armies in reserve, unleashing them upon the invading force once the Atlantic Wall is breached. One difficulty with this plan, however, is that with the Allies incessantly bombing German transportation routes, there is no guarantee that these forces will be able to move decisively to thwart a breakout. Another potential problem is that much of his force is made up of veterans of the Eastern Front. Although they are still weary and near broken from their travails there, the Field Marshal nonetheless trusts his troops more than Rommel's defenses. The conflict between two of Germany's greatest soldiers is no surprise to Hitler. Indeed, it serves his purpose to have potential leaders fighting one another rather than united, possibly against him. To make certain that neither man acquires disproportionate sway over the soldier in the field, Hitler places himself in command of the armored reserve in the Western Theater. He perhaps is right to be worried that his commanders in the West might turn on him. For although Rommel and von Rundstedt might differ in their approaches to combating the invasion, they both, if defeated, intend to ask Hitler to end the war and sue for peace.
Tradition. What would military life be without it? Tradition is, after all, what binds the present to the past, one man to another. What makes a group of individuals into a battle-ready whole. Tradition can be a simple thing, the courtesy of a salute, the correct display of one's uniform. Or it can be something more complicated, more difficult to master, the correct handling of the stars and stripes. Imagine a ship setting off on the dangerous run from Hawaii to the war in the Pacific. The crew is the regular mix of grizzled veterans and fresh recruits. The recruits are referred to by the mildly disparaging nickname shellbacks and are watched carefully, inspected almost daily, checked and rechecked, and naturally found wanting. Halfway across, there are rumors of mysterious messages being received in the radio room. The messages seem garbled, nonsensical, but are ominous nonetheless. Prepare, they say, for the arrival of King Neptune.
The captain orders additional watch. Those posted are, this seems more coincidence than anything, shellbacks. Day and night they stare out to sea, growing bleary-eyed in their fear that they might miss something important, or perhaps even see something that wasn't there. Something out of the ordinary, even peculiar. Something that by all rules of logic and sanity could not possibly be there. The Master Chief in a dress, for example. Talk about your Poseidon adventure. Oh, we know, the Master Chief and his consort aren't really in dresses. It's more like, call it ceremonial robes. They are portraying King Neptune and various of his deep-sea denizens, come to inspect the ship and initiate the shellbacks into the fraternity of those salts who have crossed the equator. Leave it to Americans to turn a moment of serious introspection into an occasion for a merciless frat house hazing. After all, it's just a little harmless fun, right? Well, sort of. But this is where it gets kind of weird. You see, as adolescent as this may seem, it does serve a purpose. The same purpose, in fact, that all military ritual serves. The binding of individuals into a battle-ready whole. In this case, the rite of passage allows the non-commissioned officers to loosen up in front of their charges. They cease to be intimidating elders and become more accessible to the men they will lead into battle. The inexperienced enlisted men, on the other hand, are recognized for passing a significant seafaring milestone. They are yet to be tested in battle, but at least they are no longer shellbacks. Tradition. It takes many forms, but in all of them, large and small, sublime and absurd, there is nobility, dignity, and, yes, even beauty. We just wish that King Neptune's date wasn't quite so hairy. In the end, the invasion the world has been waiting for comes down to one man, Dwight David Eisenhower. At war's outbreak, an obscure lieutenant colonel. A joyful and self-effacing man who will ultimately answer the world's question, when? The other questions have all been answered. That there would be an invasion of Western Europe has long been inevitable. Joseph Stalin, whose nation lies nearly destroyed, demanded it. The English and Americans promised their ally a second front years before they could deliver it. The Russians, in the meantime, fought in their own cities, losing millions of people to the war while their allies prepared. That task was worldwide, in factories and fields, in the hard work and deeply felt prayers of people who had never set foot in Europe, but who nonetheless did what they could to make the invasion a reality. Long after the preparations began, where the invasion would take place remained to be decided. Britain and the United States fought bitterly, one preferring to invade Europe from the south and the other the north. In the end, the simple fact that America would provide the majority of the manpower and materiel for the invasion gave it the deciding vote, the northern coast of France. The long process of assembly began, the building of a force like none before. Great Britain became a warehouse for men, food, ammunition, and equipment, along with the thousands of ships it would take to carry it all across the English Channel and into history. In August of 1943, the Americans and British had promised the Soviets an invasion by the following May. But when the date was finally set, it was later than that and deemed so secret that Stalin has not been told. 5 June, 1944. As the target date nears, Ike, understandably enough, is filled with doubt. There are so many variables to consider, so many details that may have been missed. Failure is a very real possibility. If the invasion force is thrown back, it will be years before the Allies can mount another. That would give the Germans more time to dig in. the fragile alliance against them more time to fragment. The possibility of a long Nazi night over Europe looms large. The Germans know an invasion is coming, but they don't know where or when. Like the rest of the world, they are waiting, looking for clues, searching for some sign. On 1st June, they get it. A coded transmission from the Allies to the French underground over the BBC, a line of poetry. The long sobs of the violins of August. It might seem just a bit of broadcasting nonsense, but German spies have known for months the line is a call for readiness, that the invasion is very close. That same day in London, Ike and his staff begin to receive twice daily briefings on the weather. The long-term patterns are dismal. Winds that would keep even the hardiest ships in port. Clouds that would make air cover impossible. Eisenhower's counselors are far from unified. Some offer dire warnings of failure, last-minute appeals for changes in the plan. Among the most vociferous is British Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, who warns Eisenhower that the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, which are to be dropped behind Nazi lines to protect the invasion's right flank, will suffer 80% casualties. The assembled forces move forward. The world waits. The weather doesn't change. On 4 June, the troops board landing craft that do not budge from their docks. Supply ships are filled, stationed offshore, ready. The weather, however, still does not change, and the invasion is postponed. Aboard the ships, the troops huddle, waiting in near silence. On 5 June, the weather report improves marginally. The storms will still be near, but there will be breaks in the cloud cover, opening a 24-hour window. It is enough, and Eisenhower gives the order. 6 June 1944 will be the day. Eisenhower, remembering Leigh-Mallory's warnings, pays a visit to the men of the 101st Airborne Division. He jokes with the men who seem more interested in comforting their obviously tired Supreme Commander than they are in being comforted themselves. They are young and confident, and in a few hours, some or perhaps all of them will lie bleeding far from home. And they will be there, Eisenhower knows, on his order. On the night of 5 June, as the ships begin to leave the docks and the aircraft begin to take off, both the Nazis and the French underground hear the same message broadcast on the BBC, the second coded line of poetry. Wound my heart with a monotonous languor, it says. The time, it tells them, is now. June 1944, England. Just after midnight, enormous formations of Allied bombers, transports, and gliders depart for Normandy in the first phase of Operation Overlord. Aboard is the first wave of the long-awaited cross-channel invasion. Paratroops of the U.S. 82nd and 101st and British 6th Airborne Divisions. Their job is to defend the flanks of the invasion beaches by securing key bridges and road junctures. The tension in the air is palpable. There is the occasional joke, gallows humor in the face of fear. But mostly all that can be heard is the drone of the engines. In France, men and women of the resistance have been doing their part to prepare for this moment. For months, they have kept a close eye on German troop movements in the region and kept Allied planners well informed. Having received the signal from the BBC that the invasion is imminent, they have begun cutting German communication and rail lines. Meanwhile, the paratroops approach their jump zones. The signal comes. The men, burdened by heavy packs, struggle to their feet. They mumble faint final prayers, and then green light. The men tumble from the planes. The invasion of Fortress Europe
is on. The American jump zone is on the right flank of the invasion, near the town of Sainte-Mère-Église on the Cotentin Peninsula. High winds, however, play havoc with the parachutes, scattering the troops over a large area. The Germans kill many before they reach the ground, unleashing brilliant streams of anti-aircraft fire against the helpless invaders. The men who get safely to the ground find themselves alone, lost in the French countryside. Their senses peaked. Every snap of a twig or rustling leaf raises the hair on the backs of their necks. Slowly, they form into small groups, attempting to reach their objectives. Several units of the 82nd land directly in Sainte-Mère-Église. A vicious street-to-street battle erupts, but with surprise on their side, the paratroops succeed in driving the startled Germans from the town, thus securing the first French city to be liberated by the Allies. To the east, the troops of the British 6th Airborne Division are charged with securing bridges over the Dives and Orne rivers. In addition, they are to silence a massive German battery near Merville that is zeroed in on the far eastern invasion beach. In a daring maneuver, the Brits in Horsa gliders land mere yards from a crucial bridge over the Orne. The Germans, caught completely off guard, are quickly routed. A small cafe near the bridge is set up as a field hospital, and the troops brace themselves for a counterattack. Near Merville, things don't go as easily. Upon landing, the battalion designated to silence the battery is shattered, reduced from 700 to merely 150 men. The survivors know that if they don't knock out the battery, the landings will be cut to pieces. Fighting overwhelming odds and lacking proper equipment, they attack. Casualties are horrendous as the men fight their way through the German defenses, but within an hour they have claimed their costly prize. After a harrowing night, the roar of naval gunfire can be heard in the distance. It is a welcome sound to the weary ears of the Allied paratroops. They have done their part to assure the success of Operation Overlord. Both flanks are secure, and exit roads from the beaches are in Allied hands. The airborne troops must hang on until relieved, but for now, all they can do is pray for the thousands of men who are about to step into history on the beaches of Normandy. June 1944, the Normandy coast. The waiting is over. All of the preparations of the past 3 years culminate in this moment. The vast Allied invasion fleet, determined to wrest Europe from the grip of Adolf Hitler, unleashes thousands of tons of high explosives on the German defenders ashore. Aboard the transports, men begin to board the smaller landing craft that will carry them ashore into the teeth of the German defenses. A storm in the channel mercilessly pounds the tiny open craft as they begin to assemble into assault waves. Pitching to and fro, the men are drenched by the cold ocean spray and their stomachs roil. The beach has been divided into 5 landing zones. To the far west, a beach codenamed Utah is to be assaulted by the U.S. 7th Corps under the command of General Lightning Joe Collins. To their east, on Omaha Beach, the U.S. 5th Corps will land under the command of Major General Leonard Giroux. Taking the 3 eastern beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, falls to the 1st and 30th British Corps, commanded respectively by Lieutenant Generals J.T. Crocker and G.T. Bucknell. As the landing craft approach, the naval and aerial bombardment builds to a crescendo. The beach erupts in geysers of smoke and flying debris. On the far left, on Sword Beach, the men of the British 3rd Infantry Division meet lighter resistance than expected. The German defenders are largely conscripted Russians and Eastern Europeans, not top-of-the-line Wehrmacht troops. The Brits quickly fight their way off the beaches and begin pushing inland to link up with the paratroops of the 6th Division. On Juneau, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division comes ashore. Underwater mines destroy many of the landing craft before they reach the beach, and tank support is late to arrive. Once ashore, however, the Canadians begin to push inland. Here, too, the defenders are largely foreign conscripts. They put up a token fight, but are not inclined to die for the glory of the Fuhrer. Prisoners pour in. On Gold Beach, the British right flank, assault troops run into stiffer resistance. Here, German gun emplacements that survived the pre-invasion bombardment pound the beach, and the 50th British Infantry Division bogs down. Troops continue to stream ashore, however. The Germans eventually give way. The Brits begin to break out toward Bayeux. American troops coming ashore at Utah Beach are pulled 2,000 yards east of their assigned zone by strong coastal currents. What appears at first to be disastrous for the U.S. 4th Division turns out, in fact, to be a lucky break. The defenses in this area have been wholly decimated by naval gunfire. Giant coastal guns are heaps of twisted metal, and machine gun pits have been buried in avalanches of sand and debris. Resistance is quickly smashed, and by afternoon, advance units have made contact with the paratroops of the 82nd. On Omaha, however, disaster looms. The rough seas and bitter German resistance threaten to throw the men of the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions back into the sea. Prevented by underwater obstacles from approaching too close to shore, assault troops and armor are deposited in up to 6 feet of rolling sea. Dual-drive tanks, unable to weather the heavy surf, sink long before reaching shore. The men, heavily laden with equipment, struggle through the chest-deep water, subjected to streams of machine gun fire and crashing shells. Many who are wounded, unable to fight the surging sea, drown. Those who reach shore huddle behind beach obstacles, gasping for breath, longing for safety. The only place that offers any measure of safety, however, is a low seawall up to 300 yards inland. To reach it, they must bolt across the open beach, which is raked by German machine gun fire. Hundreds die in the frantic dash. The beach is littered with the broken bodies of men and smoldering equipment. The tide runs red with blood. In the struggle for individual survival, unit cohesion is entirely lost. Casualties among officers are shocking. Leaderless, the stunned men, many lacking helmets, weapons, and ammunition, huddle helplessly behind the seawall. The beach quickly garners the morbid nickname, Bloody Omaha. By mid-morning, the outcome is still in doubt. In an effort to break the German stranglehold on the beach, destroyers pull in close to shore and pound the German positions at close range. The tactic is risky. There is little margin for error, and the ships are well within the range of German artillery. It doesn't take long, however, for the sailors to home in on their targets and silence some of the Nazis' most effective defensive positions. The veteran troops of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, begin to drive up the surrounding bluffs. Their push is heroic, and by 11 o'clock they capture their first objective, the town of Virville. Soon thereafter, resistance slackens, and follow-up troops begin to pour ashore. The landings have been a success. Despite the horrendous losses at Omaha, casualties have been far lighter than expected. Now, with troops ashore on 5 beaches, the Allies must quickly consolidate the beachhead and begin to drive inland. For although the first giant step has been taken, there remains a long journey ahead. June 1944, Normandy. Shortly after midnight, the stillness of the French night is broken by the drone of hundreds of aircraft passing overhead. First thought to be just another flight of Allied bombers, it quickly becomes apparent that this is much more. The alarm is sounded. The Allies are coming. Although the German troops have for months known that sooner or later they would have to face an Allied invasion, they are stunned to see them on this night. Their commanders from the highest levels have assured them that the weather conditions are far too severe for the Allies to attempt an assault. So comforted by the poor weather, many top commanders are not at their headquarters. Heading up this list is Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who is in Berlin conferring with Hitler and celebrating his wife's birthday. The commander of the 7th Army, Colonel General Friedrich Dollmann, whose forces guard the beaches from Caen to the Cotentin Peninsula, has gone, along with much of his staff, to a map exercise in Rennes. Many other officers, their superiors absent, availed themselves of the French nightlife. At 7th Army headquarters, reports begin to filter in about the Allied paratroop landings. At first, the information is sketchy, indicating scattered Allied airdrops south of Cherbourg and near the Orne River. Those reports quickly change as excited local commanders erroneously report over 96,000 Allied paratroops landing all over Normandy. Dollmann, upon receiving the information, wastes no time in reacting. Convinced the fight for France is on, he alerts the entire 7th Army. Word is then passed up the chain to Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. By 6 a.m., von Rundstedt is convinced this is a major invasion of northern France and contacts Hitler to secure the release of the panzer divisions held in reserve. Amazingly, he is told that the Führer is sleeping and is not to be awakened. Shortly after 6 a.m., with naval gunfire crashing down around them, the defenders of the Normandy beaches scramble to battle stations. Peering out to sea, they are amazed to see an armada unlike any ever assembled, with thousands of landing craft bearing down on the beaches. Many of the defenders have no stomach for fighting such an overwhelming force, but the men of the elite 352nd Division, guarding Omaha Beach, are determined to drive the invaders into the sea. Nestled in the hills overlooking the landing zone, they rake the beach with machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire. It's like a shooting gallery. There's a grudging respect for the Americans who doggedly advance in the face of such deadly fire. Back in Berlin, Hitler, now awake, is highly agitated. He sharply questions his generals. Well, is it or isn't it the invasion? Could this be a diversion for a main assault on the Pas-de-Calais? No one is certain. Finally, at 3, 12 hours after receiving the first report, Hitler releases the panzers to support the 7th Army. It may be too late. The battle for the beaches, so crucial in Rommel's strategy, is over. Although fierce fighting rages inland, the Allies have a solid beachhead over a wide stretch of coast. Still, the panzer divisions are fierce, quite capable of turning the tables on the Allies. Time is crucial. They must reach the coast quickly if they are to make a difference. Rommel speeds back from Berlin. When told of the invasion, the field marshal, cursing his reliance on the weather, comments to an officer, "How stupid of me. How stupid of me." June 1944, New York City. At 3:32 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, first word of the Normandy invasion is broadcast to the United States via shortwave radio from General Eisenhower's headquarters in Britain. As word spreads, the world becomes an audience captivated, and the phrase European theater takes on new meaning. Everyone, everywhere, is terrified and thrilled by the spectacle unfolding on the Norman stage. Among the first to hear the news are the swing shift workers in the factories which produced the props for the drama, the very vehicles and weapons making the invasion possible. Europeans first learn of the invasion in a number of ways: radio broadcasts, word of mouth, and newspapers. The people of Britain, suffering these 4 years the constant worry and strain of life on the defensive, scour the papers for every detail of the Allied onslaught. The people of France, some of whom first hear of the invasion through the shots and explosions of battle, gain something which they have dreamed of since the Nazi invasion: the promise of freedom. Across the country, citizens collectively hold their breaths in anticipation of an end to their long occupation. For the German people, the papers bring less joy. Confusion and tight Nazi censorship result in reports that are unrealistically positive. Readers of the news, however, cannot help but feel a bit of dread. The German people, for the first time, have an inkling that perhaps the Third Reich's moment in the sun is coming to a close. Little do the men on the beaches know that they are the world's actors. While the names of their directors are famous, the fate of the world hinges on the performance of the bit players. The prayers and hopes of entire nations rest not with Generals Eisenhower, Montgomery, or Rommel, but with men struggling in the sand, their names unknown to all but a handful of loved ones. The generals, too, have for a short while been relegated to the status of audience members. They spend the day like the rest of the world, anxiously awaiting reports of success or failure. A day's worth of reports pile up. Casualties, while high, are not as grievous as expected. Prior to the landings, estimates had soared to as many as 25,000 Allied dead and wounded. As the grisly count mounts in reality, however, it adds up to 10,000. A full quarter of these are comprised of the first men into France, airborne units who dropped behind enemy lines before daybreak. Another quarter of the casualties are men lost in the battle at Omaha Beach. That fight, while brutal, seems to have finally fallen in the Americans' favor. Lines have stabilized, and the men have been able to dig in, preparing for the next day's battle. As D-Day draws to a close, Allied commanders who have spent months planning must now use a very different skill. Their elaborate plan finally set into motion, the generals must now prepare to improvise, to abandon what is carefully considered in favor of daring gambles. What this means in the coming months is anyone's guess. But one thing is certain. For the civilians who knew nothing of Overlord yesterday, for the generals who had only a plan, and for the soldiers who were simply awaiting orders, the world has changed. After years of waiting, suffering, and watching, the curtain has finally risen on the drama that will decide the fate of the world.
June 1944, Rome. Arriving triumphantly, commander of the Fifth Army, General Mark Clark, parades through the town, claiming his mantle as liberator of the Eternal City. Clark's success in capturing Rome is a direct result of competition with his British and French counterparts. Since the breakouts at Anzio and Cassino, Allied commanders have directed a great deal of their attention to the race for Rome. Commander of ground forces in Italy, General Sir Harold Alexander's initial plan for Operation Diadem called for Clark's Fifth Army to throw itself into the pursuit, encirclement, and destruction of the German 10th Army at Valmontone. Instead, Clark shifted just enough of his troops to that mission in order not to be insubordinate, but threw the weight of his army northward. For the past week, they have been fighting their way up Highway 6 just ahead of their British counterparts for the glory of liberating Rome. French troops under General Alphonse Juin have also been involved in the competition. Their purpose in getting to the Eternal City first was to reach Pope Pius XII and deliver a message from Charles de Gaulle. Disgusted by the pontiff's endorsement of the Vichy government, he wished to explain to the Pope why he should throw his support behind the Free French. On 2 June, Pius XII made a public statement, a warning of sorts to those who might turn Rome into a battleground. He spoke of God's judgment against those who would harm the Eternal City. The next day, wary of losing more public support after the bombing fiasco at Cassino, the Allies made a radio broadcast. Mediterranean Theater Commander General Henry Jumbo Wilson said that Rome would be turned into a battleground only if the Germans used it for military advantage. On 3 June, Hitler finally decided that his troops would be better able to make a stand north of Rome and gave the order for their withdrawal from the city. Early in the morning of 4 June, French units found themselves the targets of a strafing run by American fighters. Enraged, General Juin believed that the attack was a deliberate attempt to stop the French advance. But the planes had also strafed American columns that they had mistaken for German. 4 June, the last German troops withdrew from Rome. Even as they trickled out of the north side of town, the Allies began pouring in from the south, transferring possession of the city almost without seeing one another. This triumphant arrival of Allied troops in an Axis capital, the first such event of the war, was greeted initially by only empty streets. As the troops continued to pour into the city, however, Roman civilians began to fill the streets, joyously greeting their liberators. The transfer is made official when Clark parades through the streets. Although he has succeeded in securing the first Axis capital of the war, it has been at a great cost. In refusing to pursue the 10th Army, Clark has passed up the opportunity to crush a large portion of Germany's strength in Italy in order to bask in the light of conquest. Ultimately, the importance of this strategic failure can only be measured when the value of the morale boost provided by the seizure of Rome has been determined. The city does offer a concrete sense of accomplishment, but there is a lingering sense that even though the Allies have their trophy, most of the battle remains to be fought. June 1944, Normandy. After enduring what most participants will forever remember as their longest day, Allied troops watch as the rising sun illuminates a scene of horrific destruction. Beaches are littered with smoldering equipment. Bodies wash ashore in the surf. Fields and pastures are cluttered with broken remnants of gliders, and parachutes entangled in trees suspend their lifeless cargo in the wind. The dawn of a new day, however, brings no respite to the bitter fighting that has raged since the first assault troops hit the beaches 24 hours earlier. On the right flank, the Americans have had a harrowing night. Isolated units of the 82nd Airborne holding positions on the Merde River hang on by a thread. Having withstood continuous German counterattacks, they run dangerously low on ammunition and stand in desperate need of relief. Additional parachute drops and glider landings are ordered to help stabilize their position, but as yet there is no relief in sight. Indeed, supply problems are a major source of concern for 5th Corps commanders. Omaha Beach, the site of such a brutal fight yesterday, is so littered with debris that supplies barely trickle ashore. Navy personnel work feverishly to clear landing areas, but make little progress, and they are forced to direct traffic elsewhere. It is to the east, however, that the invasion faces its gravest threat. Here, the British, having had tremendous initial success, face increasing resistance by German armor. After finally convincing Hitler to release the reserve panzer divisions, General Friedrich Dollmann directed them to shield Caen and smash the British beachhead. As the panzers begin to arrive, the British drive bogs down. Hopelessly outgunned, the Sherman, Churchill, and Cromwell tanks stand little chance against the Mark V Panthers and Mark VI Tigers. Armed with deadly 88mm guns, the German tanks can pick off their opponents one by one without ever getting in range of the Allied guns. The German tankers, however, do not have all the advantages. Simply getting to the front has, for them, been an ordeal. Allied fighter bombers have a devastating effect on the German armor columns streaming toward the front. Roaming the skies almost uncontested, They maul the German convoys, making effective resupply and reinforcement virtually impossible. It has become a bitter joke in the German ranks that if you see a black plane, it is American. If you see a white plane, it is the RAF. And if you see no plane, it is the Luftwaffe. Especially effective have been Hawker Typhoons and P-47 Thunderbolts armed with anti-tank rockets. The rockets allow the pilots to attack the convoys from a safer distance and with greater accuracy than conventional bombs. Throughout the day, the battle rages as the Allies attempt to consolidate their front. 7th Corps units from Utah Beach fight their way inland toward Carentan on their left flank and Montebourg on the right. The fighting is slow and costly. The thick hedgerows that crisscross the Normandy countryside from Bayeux to the Cotentin are perfectly suited for defense, and the Germans, as always, take full advantage of their surroundings. U.S. armor units take heavy losses, and the infantry must bear the brunt of the battle. On the 5th Corps front, the troops from Omaha Beach drive east toward Bayeux and west toward Isigny. On 8 June, they meet British units from Gold Beach at Port-en-Bassin, linking the U.S. and British beachheads, but their drive west is stymied by tough German resistance. On the same day, units of the 50th British Division, who have been bogged down in a bloody stalemate, finally break the German defenses at Bayeux, claiming the first major French city to be captured by the Allies. The fall of the city is an essential step toward the isolation and destruction of the defenders of Caen. On 10 June, troops of the 101st Airborne find themselves being battered in the fight for the town of Carentan. The defenders, determined to hold their position, fight with such tenacity that even veteran troops are stunned. On 12 June, however, the men of the Screaming Eagle Division prevail, thereby linking the two American beachheads and giving the Allies a continuous lodgment on the north coast of France, 10 miles deep and 60 miles wide. Although the Allies are now firmly established on French soil, Hitler and the German High Command are still unconvinced that this is the invasion. Allied leaders are as amazed as they are delighted that their intricate deception operation continues to work so well. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, however, is anything but delighted. Convinced that the Normandy landings are the main Allied thrust into northwest Europe, he is furious that Hitler will not release the panzers from the Pas-de-Calais. Without those forces, he knows, there is no chance of stopping the Allies in Normandy. And if they are not stopped in Normandy, they will not be stopped until they are in Berlin. "7 June 1944, the Mariana Islands. Japanese troops are caught completely off guard by an overwhelming aerial assault by pilots of U.S. Task Force 58. Flying from carriers 200 miles to the east, the naval aviators open Operation Forager with near impunity. As Japanese pilots scramble to get into the air, the U.S. aviators go about the job of destroying enemy planes and ships in an almost relaxed manner. The reasons for the early success of the attack are many, but it is due in great part to the time of day. Most carrier strikes are launched in the early morning hours, but in order to increase his chances of surprising the Japanese on Saipan and Tinian, Admiral Raymond Spruance takes advantage of the exceptionally clear afternoon and launches the opening sortie of Operation Forager a day early. The product of 3 months of intense planning by Marine General Holland Smith and Admiral Spruance and Kelly Turner, Operation Forager is an offensive rivaled only by Overlord in its scale and complexity. Aimed at the capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, Forager marks the first Allied attempt to break Japan's innermost defensive perimeter. Saipan's Aslito airfield is the first objective of Forager. Once taken, it will provide the U.S. Army Air Force an air base from which to launch its new B-29 superfortresses against Japan. Seizure of Aslito will also severely limit Japan's ability to patrol crucial sea lanes. The opening strike of Forager is catastrophic for the Japanese. By the end of the first day, 147 fighters, 3 warships, and 30,000 tons of shipping have been destroyed by the marauding American pilots. For the next 2 days, Task Force 58 launches an almost constant series of attacks against Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, destroying an incredible number of enemy planes. Japanese commanders in the Marianas failed to inform Tokyo of the magnitude of their losses. Realizing that they had been caught unprepared by a major Allied offensive, the Japanese command dispatches 2 fleets to help repulse the invasion. While aware that their ships are hopelessly outgunned by the American Armada, they assume land-based aircraft in the Marianas will be able to protect them. These land-based aircraft, however, no longer exist, leaving the fleet at a distinct disadvantage. On 14 June, in preparation for impending amphibious landings, U.S. battleships are brought to the fore to pound Japanese beach defenses on Saipan. On 15 June, men of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions land just north and south of Afetna Point on the eastern side of Saipan. The Marines anticipate a difficult battle against the island's 30,000 Japanese defenders, but a carefully timed final airstrike suppresses most opposition. Within 20 minutes, over 8,000 Americans are ashore, digging in. The Japanese, however, quickly regain their senses and begin pounding the beachhead. Amidst this din, the landings continue, but further advance proves virtually impossible. By day's end, over 20,000 Marines are ashore preparing for a push inland the next day. At 3 a.m. on 16 June, 1,000 Japanese soldiers storm down the hill overlooking the beach and are immediately decimated by naval gunfire. Their commander, General Yoshitsugu Saito, calls off the attack, deciding to fight defensively until the Japanese fleet arrives and defeats the Americans. Later in the day, elements of Task Force 58 sail north towards Guam and Rota to shell airfields that threaten the U.S. fleet. At the same time, landings on Guam are canceled so that the fleet can engage the approaching Japanese naval force. On Saipan, the 2 Marine divisions battle to consolidate their beachhead before beginning their drive west towards Aslito Airfield. Meanwhile, Task Force 58 has begun its deadly game of cat and mouse with the Imperial Navy. Aware that his primary responsibility is to protect the landings on Saipan, Spruance gambles that the Japanese are more anxious to engage his force than smash the beachhead, and he sails away from the island, hoping to draw them into a decisive engagement. Whether his gamble pays off or not remains to be seen, but the consequences of his action will dramatically affect the course of the war. If Operation Forager is defeated, the entire Marianas campaign will collapse, and the strategic bombing of Japan will be postponed indefinitely. If, on the other hand, Spruance succeeds in crushing the enemy surface fleet, the once vaunted Imperial Navy will cease to be an effective fighting force, and the Japanese, who started the war with visions of expansion and conquest, will soon face a force that threatens their very existence. June 1944, Pas-de-Calais. From a handful of carefully concealed launch sites along the English Channel, the Luftwaffe launches the first of Nazi Germany's secret vengeance weapons toward England. A jet-powered, pilotless aircraft, the V-1 can deliver a nearly 2,000-pound warhead to a target 600 miles away. The British have known since 1939 that the Germans were working on unmanned missile bombs. In 1943, a sharp-eyed intelligence researcher inspecting reconnaissance photos reported a test of what she called an airplane without a cockpit. Alerted that the Third Reich's secret weapons might be moving from drawing board to battlefield, the Allies began a close inspection of thousands of intelligence photos. They soon uncovered unusual military installations under construction at Vatan on the French coast, and later all along the Pas-de-Calais. Though the Allies knew little of the weapons' specifics, in December 1943, they launched Operation Crossbow, a series of airstrikes designed to cripple V-1 testing, manufacture, and launch sites. Hitler ordered the facilities rebuilt, believing that his V-weapons would turn the tide of the war. He insisted that their impact would be more strategic than tactical, disheartening the long-suffering British by reviving the nightly air raids on London. The British, who demonstrated early in the war that they could take all the Luftwaffe could dish out, proved immune to the Nazi bombast, choosing to believe the Allied command's assurances that Operation Crossbow had eliminated the V-1 threat. What the Allies didn't know was that far from destroying the V-1 program, Crossbow had merely forced it underground. Manufacturing plants and weapons storage and launch facilities disappeared from aerial photographs, not because they had been destroyed, but because they had been moved and carefully camouflaged. In fact, by April 1944, there were more than 1,200 V-1s and 7 launch sites ready and waiting for Hitler's order to attack. Within hours after the Allied invasion, he instructed the Luftwaffe to unleash the V-1s on Target 42, the Nazi code for London. The continual D-Day bombing, however, caused enough damage that it took 6 days to prepare the attack. During that time, the Allies grew more confident that their anti-V-1 strategy was working. Allied planners were, in fact, so confident that they shelved without action a report received immediately after the invasion that the Nazis were moving V-1s by train to launch sites. On the opening night of Hitler's Vengeance War, the Nazis managed to prepare and launch 11 V-1s. 4 of the bombs nose over and crash almost immediately. 2 others simply disappear over the channel. The British take some notice, however, of the other 5. Reports roll in of mysterious weapons exploding in the Thames estuary, and one destroying a railroad bridge, killing 6 people. On 13 June, Winston Churchill, after reading intelligence reports underestimating the V-1's range and speed, announces to his cabinet that the Nazis' secret weapon is an empty bluff. In Germany, Hitler is livid. He orders another attack, much larger, to be launched as soon as possible. It comes the night of 15 June. The Nazis open up with a barrage of more than 300 V-1s, of which 73 land on London. The enormity of the attacks rocks Churchill from complacency. He pronounces the new threat a burden perhaps heavier than the air raids of 1940 and 1941. The RAF reassigns bombers to Operation Crossbow. The people of London, who had thought themselves hardened, once again find themselves tested against the sudden and arbitrary violence of modern warfare.